lower middle class Lansing, where you know, all the white people that I knew had good jobs. They were working at Fisher Body or General Motors. They were making cars. They were making, you know, good money, $30 an hour, which was a lot back then. They had good benefits. And yeah, they were probably mostly racists, but they weren't voting for racists. They weren't, you know, carrying around Confederate flags. They weren't strapping AR-15s to their chest and strutting around like street gangs, you know, threatening people's lives. What's the difference? What happened? What brought the racists out of the woodwork? And in this article, basically, I lay out this hypothesis, which, you know, I've shared with you in the past, but I think, you know, it's worth revisiting from time to time. That what is, you know, in fact, all over social media, people are asking, why would anybody embrace fascism? I mean, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about fascism. There's this worldwide movement toward fascism. Rachel Maddow opened her show with it last night on MSNBC, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I watched it on the plane from Salt Lake City here. We had a stopover. And I think it's safety. You know, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very bottom, of course, is homeostasis. You need to breathe, you need to drink water, you need to, you know, be able to do bodily functions, basically, maintain your body temperature, stuff like that. But right above that is safety. You know, if you're crossing a street and all of a sudden cars are whizzing by you in both directions, you're not thinking about, you know, what you're going to have for dinner or what you want to do with your career goals or you know, whether you should propose to that to your new girlfriend or what. I mean, what you're thinking about is, how do I avoid getting hit by a car? And what has happened over the last 40 years as part of the Reagan Revolution and in response to the Powell memo, Lewis Powell's memo, is that there has been this huge right-wing infrastructure built, and I would call it a neo-fascist infrastructure, frankly, because they're all promoting fascism. Not necessarily pure Nazism, but something damn close. And, you know, that includes 1,500 right-wing radio stations, that includes, I mean, if you look at the top podcasts, the top 100 podcasts, like the top 40 of them, at least 2/3 of them are right-wing podcasts. There's enormous money behind these. They promote them like crazy. They on social media, they get promotion. You've also got, you know, the owners and people running many of the social media sites are themselves billionaires and conservatives, and so they're pushing these memes as well. And so now what you have is kind of latent racism that has had a fire lit under it by the destruction of the American middle class. We've gone, and largely the white middle class, although since the 60s there was a growing black middle class and a Hispanic middle class as well. And all have taken a hit. The blacks and Hispanics have been hit harder than the whites, but the whites have been hit hard enough that, you know, the middle class in America has gone from 65% of us when Reagan came into office to 45% of us today. So you've got, you know, that 20% that got screwed, you know, the title of one of my books, The Undeclared War on the Middle Class. And these people who have literally, not literally been screwed if you use the you know, some of the definitions, but I'd say, you know, financially they've been screwed. And, you know, they know it, they're just not sure why. And so you've got this huge media structure around the country that, you know, that kind of started with Limbaugh on radio. It started with Rupert Murdoch, the Australian billionaire, on television, that have a very simple answer for these largely white people who have been financially screwed by 40 years of Reaganism. They're saying, okay, who did this to me? Why does my job pay half of what I paid in 1980? And the answer these people will say is, oh, it's because black people want your job. It's because brown-skinned immigrants want your job. It's because women want your job. And if we could just go back to, you know, pre-1965, when women had to have a man's permission to get a credit card or open a checking account, when women generally could not enter the workforce unless it was a secretary, when black people were relegated to very specific jobs, you know, janitors and things like that, and by and large separated from the rest of society. We had segregated water fountains. We still had segregated schools. If we could just go back to that, society would stabilize itself. This was Russell Kirk's great theory. He wrote a book about this. called The Conservative Mind, from Burke to Eliot. And it starts out with Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke was the famous British conservative philosopher, political economist back in the late 1700s, who wrote that, it does me no harm if a man is allowed to engage in a profession as servile as that of hairdresser or candlemaker, but it does society considerable violence if such a man is allowed to vote. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but that's pretty close to the exact quote. And this perspective has been adopted by the Republican Party. And now they've reached the logical end of this. They're actually openly, nakedly, enthusiastically promoting fascism in the United States. And they've got this whole network of right-wing billionaires behind them that are also pushing fascism in this country. And they've also got, all these radio stations and podcasts and everything. Interesting, I believe it was the Brennan Center did this study. It was published last week. I mentioned this briefly on Friday, that some of these right-wing podcasts are 11 times more likely to have lies in them than our left-wing podcasts. 11 times. That's 11,000%, right? Or 1,100% more lies. And, you wonder why people are acting crazy. You wonder why people are so angry. You wonder why people have gone so nuts. Simple answer is they're being lied to. They're being told that they are not safe. Now, they know financially they're not safe, but they're being told that that lack of safety is the result of Democrats, of liberals, of queer people, of black people, and of women. And therefore, they need to go after those people. And thus, we've got all these white guys strutting around with AR-15s strapped across their chests, wearing Confederate flags. Surprise, surprise. What do you think?
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Transgender Warriors, Making History from Joan of Arc to Marshall P. Johnson and Beyond by Leslie Feinberg. This is from the preface. Are you a guy or a girl? I've heard the question all my life. The answer is not so simple, since there are no pronouns in the English language as complex as I am, and I don't want to simplify myself in order to neatly fit one or the other. There are millions more like me in the United States alone. We have a history filled with militant heroes and heroines, yet therein lies the rub. How can I tell you about their battles when the words woman and man, feminine and masculine are almost the only words that exist in the English language to describe all the vicissitudes of bodies and styles of expression? Living struggles accelerate changes in language. I heard language evolve during the 1960s when I came out into the drag bars of Western New York and Southern Ontario. At that time, the only words used to describe us, cut and seared, yelled at us from the window of a screeching car filled with potential bashers. There were no words that we'd go out of our way to use that made us feel good about ourselves. When we all first heard the word gay, some of my friends vehemently opposed the word on the grounds that it made us sound happy. No one will ever use gay, my friends assured me, each offering an alternative word, none of which took root. I learned that language can't be ordered individually as if it's from a Sears catalog. It is forged collectively in the fiery heat of struggle. Right now, much of the sensitive language that was won by the liberation movement in the United States during the 60s and 70s is bearing the brunt of a right-wing backlash as being politically correct. Where I come from, being politically correct means using language that respects other people's oppressions and wounds. This chosen language needs to be defended. The words I use in this book may become outdated in a very short time because the transgender movement is still young and defining itself. But while the slogans lettered on the banners may change quickly, the struggle will rage on. Since I am writing this book as a contribution to the demand for transgender liberation, the language I'm using in this book is not aimed at defining, but at defending the diverse communities that are coalescing. I don't have a personal stake in whether the trans liberation movement results in a new third pronoun or gender-neutral pronouns like the ones such as Z, she or he, and here, her, his, being experimented with in cyberspace. It is not the words in and of themselves that are important to me, it's our lives. The struggle of trans people over the centuries is not a his story or her story, it's a our story. I've been called a he, she, butch, bulldagger, crossdresser, passing woman, female to male transvestite, and drag king. The word I prefer to use to describe myself is transgender. Today, the word transgender has at least two colloquial meanings. It has been used as an umbrella term to include everyone who challenges the boundaries of sex and gender. It is also used to draw a distinction between those who reassign the sex they were labeled at birth and those of us whose gender expression is considered inappropriate for our sex. Presently, many organizations, from Transgender Nation in San Francisco to Monmouth Ocean Transgender on the Jersey Shore, use this term inclusively. I asked many self-identified transgender activists who are named or pictured in this book who they believed were included under the umbrella term. Those polled named transsexuals, transgender, transvestites, transgenderists, big enders, drag queens, drag kings, crossdressers, masculine women, feminine men, intersexuals, people referred to in the past as hermaphrodites, androgynes, cross-genders, shapeshifters, passing women, passing men, gender benders, gender blenders, bearded women, and women bodybuilders who have crossed the line of what is considered socially acceptable for a female body. But the word transgender is increasingly being used in a more specific way as well. The term transgenderist was first introduced into the English language by trans warrior Virginia Prince. Prince told me, quote, "I coined the term transgenderist in 1987 or 88. There had to be some name for people like myself who trans the gender barrier, meaning somebody who lives full-time in the gender opposite to their anatomy. I have not transed the sex barrier," end quote. As the overall transgender movement has developed, more people are exploring this distinction between a person's sex, female, intersexual, male, and their gender expression, feminine, androgynous, masculine, and other variations. Many national and local gender magazines and community groups are starting to use TS/TG, transsexual and transgender. Under Western law, doctors glance at the genitals of an infant and pronounce the baby female or male, and that's that. Transsexual men and women traverse the boundary of the sex they were assigned at birth. And in dominant Western cultures, the gender expression of
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I don't think you'll be shocked, says the Georgia grand juror. Oh, this is getting entertaining. Is Fani Willis about to drop the hammer on Donald Trump? We'll see. I mean, there are some people who are quite concerned now that the head of the grand jury. By the way, welcome to the program. We've got a lot to talk about today. Now that the chief juror, what is the head of a jury called? The foreman. That's right. The foreperson of the special grand jury. Now, one of the things I didn't realize is that this is a special grand jury in as much as it is investigative but not prosecutorial. Apparently, this is something I'll have to ask Dean Obeidallah about when he comes on the program later. I'm not an attorney. I don't understand the distinction between the two. But apparently, the Fulton County prosecutor, Fani Willis, is going to have to present this to another grand jury, to a prosecuting grand jury, which she has a regular one that meets 2 days a week in Atlanta that she can do that with. We'll see how it shakes out. But there are people who are concerned that this woman speaking out might actually be, her name is Emily Kors. She said, there may be some names on that list that you wouldn't expect, but the big name that everyone keeps asking me about, I don't think you'll be shocked. And obviously the big name everybody's asking about is Donald Trump. So, but there are some people who are saying, wait a minute, by talking like this, she's polluting another potential jury pool and maybe helping the defendant. I doubt that's her goal. She seems to be just kind of starstruck, blinded by the, the momentary attention of the world. But, we'll see. We'll see how this shakes out. Death is the new Republican badge of honor, actually death and destruction having to do with Medicaid. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. Also, Marjorie Taylor Greene is calling for a national divorce. Just like on January 6th now, Fox News is amplifying it, trying to help blow up America. Literally, pun intended. At the top of our second hour, Dean Obeidallah is going to drop by, my colleague here on Sirius XM's channel 127. The Serious Progress channel. Nicky Haley, he's got a brilliant piece about Nicky Haley's despicable whitewashing of racism. And also in the second hour, the fascism experiment in Florida rolls on. Ron DeSantis has introduced a bill to reconsider press freedom. Yeah, he's following on Viktor Orban's footsteps. And also in the second hour, Donald Trump perils from fraud prosecutions just increased with the publication today of a shocking new article in Forbes magazine. I'll give you the details on that. I mean, they've been following this guy since the 80s, and carefully. I mean, this is the magazine that chronicles the lives of billionaires, basically. And so I'll give you all the gory details on that in the second hour of our program. In the third hour of the program, Kathay Feng is going to be with us. Shelby County versus Holder, this Supreme Court decision where 5 Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted our voting rights and civil rights. Happened 10 years ago today. We will be talking about that with Kathay Feng. And also, why is Donald Trump visiting East Palestine, or Palestine, I guess they pronounce it? Is he returning to the scene of his crime? We'll talk about that in the third hour. And Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene continue to support Putin's slaughter in Ukraine, but some Republicans are doing the right thing. And I want to salute them, even though one of them's Darrell Issa. I'll tell you about that in the third hour of the program as well. They actually went to Kyiv. God bless them. So, to start out with, my opening rant, my daily take over at HartmannReport.com is titled, Death is the New Republican Badge of Honor. And what got me started on this was a fascinating article in the Washington Post, which I'll get to in just a second. But the article starts out with Joe Biden during the State of the Union address saying that some of my Republican friends want to sunset. Well, here's exactly what he said. He said, instead of making the wealthy pay their fair share, some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. And at that point, the whole chamber burst into boos and foot stomping and Marjorie Taylor Greene shouting, liar, liar. What he was referring to, of course, was Rick Scott's program to end Medicare and Social Security within 5 years. Rick Scott has since, this was his 12-point plan to rescue America. He has since backed away from the 5-year sunset provision. But that's not the worst of it. That's really not even the beginning of it. The Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010. That was the year that Rick Scott, now senator from Florida, became the governor of Florida. He was elected governor of Florida. He became governor in January the following year. And he'd recently come off a gig as the CEO of the hospital giant chain Columbia HCA, which while he was CEO of the company, was convicted of the largest Medicare fraud in United States history. A fraud that Scott apparently oversaw because 100% of this fraud happened while he was CEO. The company paid an $840 million criminal fine. Corporations don't go to jail, and neither did Rick Scott. And he walked away with about $100 million, which he used in part to fund his campaign for governor. But that's not the worst of it. Charlene Dill. I've talked about Charlene Dill on this program for years. Her best friend, Kathleen Voss Woolrich, came on the program and told us about her friend Charlene. Charlene was the mother of 3 young children in Florida, was struggling with medical debt because she had been diagnosed at the age of 30 with a heart condition. And she had to take medication for her heart, and she couldn't afford the medication. And so she was cutting her pills in half. She was working 3 full-time jobs. The third job was selling vacuum cleaners door to door, essentially. And so after she had done her main job throughout the day, she had a daycare job and she was cleaning houses, and she'd been cleaning houses all day that day. She went out that night to sell vacuum cleaner, a vacuum cleaner to a couple near Orlando. And while there, her heart stopped. She fell over and died. And they took her to the emergency room, but it was too late. And it was because she'd been cutting her pills in half, and she'd been cutting her pills in half because the Affordable Care Act had expanded Medicaid to all people like Charlene, all working people, low-income working people in the country. But a bunch of Republican states sued all the way to the Supreme Court to say this is wrong. It's unconstitutional for the federal government to force us to provide free health care to our low-income people. And 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court went along with that decision. And so now you've got 11 states, Florida being one of them. Every single day of Rick Scott's 8 years as governor of Florida, every day he made the decision anew to refuse to expand Medicaid. Thus, Charlene Dill died. But that's not the worst of it. This story I mentioned at the very beginning of the Washington Post, staff writer Andrew Van Dam, he writes this column for the Washington Post called the Department of Data. And he came across a really fascinating little bit of data trivia, which is that there are 11 states where the average person in those states has a worse credit rating than in any other state in the country. And he couldn't figure out why. These were, 9 of them are southern states, and then there's Missouri and Oklahoma. And he was like, why? Why these states? Excuse me, Missouri and Wyoming. Why these states? Why these 11 states? And he thought at first, well, it has to do with poverty. But it turns out the poverty rate in those states, while it's high, there are areas, he did it on a county-by-county basis. And even in wealthy counties, the suburbs of Atlanta and whatnot, Miami, in these states, you still had lousy credit scores. Why? Didn't make sense. So then he looked at race. Maybe it's because of discrimination against, black people and Hispanics and whatnot. But there were other states in the country, other counties in the country that had, the same racial makeup that didn't have lousy credit scores. So what was it? So finally, he reached out to a fellow who was the chief economist. His name is Bruno Braga, for the Urban Institute. And he said, why would this be? Just these 11 states have lousy credit scores. And Braga said, and I quote, the reason why credit scores are so low in the South has got to be connected to medical debt, because that's the most common type of unpaid bill that people have. And sure enough, Van Dam looked into it, and he writes in the Washington Post, quote, of the 100 counties with the highest share of adults struggling to pay their medical debt, 92 are in the South, and the other 8 are in neighboring Oklahoma and Missouri. Did I say Wyoming? Oklahoma and Missouri. My apologies. These are the 11 states where Republican governors, Republican-controlled legislatures, Republican multimillionaires and billionaires have, funded editorial conservative newspapers and hate talk radio and TV, where Republicans run everything in these 11 states, and they all have refused to expand Medicaid, just like Rick Scott did, just like Greg Abbott proudly brags in Texas that he won't expand Medicaid. Ron DeSantis proudly brags down in Florida that he's not going to expand Medicaid. These people are eagerly, enthusiastically destroying families through medical debt. Destroying families through medical debt. And medical debt increases the risk of child abuse. And now we've got this Republican in Alaska, Don Eastman, a Republican state representative, saying, well, that's just a fine thing. Here he is. I think.
In the case where child abuse is fatal, obviously it's not good for the child, but it's actually a benefit to society because there aren't needed for government services and whatnot over the whole course of that child's life.
Through the chair, can you say that again? Did you say a benefit for society?
Talking dollars. Now, you've got
Yes.
a $1.5 million price tag here for victims of fatal child abuse. It gets argued periodically that it's actually a cost savings because that child doesn't need any of those government services that they might otherwise be entitled to receive and need based on growing up in this type of environment.
Yeah,
Through the chair.
In other words, being alive. So now we come to the very worst of it, and that is the Republicans are actually proud of the fact that they are refusing to expand Medicaid, and that is killing people in these 11 red states. They're actually proud of it. It's a benefit to society, don't you know? Mind-boggling. But hey, that's today's GOP. We'll be right back, 18 minutes past the hour. How is Medicaid doing in your state? Stick around. We'll be right back with you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
National divorce. We'll talk about that in just a moment. This is I mean, just truly incredible. When you go back and look at it, by not expanding Medicaid, and this is another one of the points that I make in the article, by not expanding Medicaid, in these 11 states, these Republican governors and state legislatures are condemning people to lower credit scores because they have medical debt. Medical debt lowers credit scores. That lower credit score then means that if they want to have a car to drive to work, they have to pay a higher interest rate for the car loan. So their transportation costs more. If they want to buy a house, they have to pay a higher interest rate for their mortgage. So their housing costs more. If they want to rent, people with low credit scores pay more for rent. Or if they can get a place to rent at all, because the landlords say that people with low credit scores are more likely to be deadbeats, and so they're jacking up their rent to cover those costs. I mean, this is just surprise, shouldn't surprise any of us. If I've been saying Medicare, I meant Medicaid. Have I been misspeaking? Malcolm in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania. Hey, Malcolm, what's up?
Happy Wednesday, Tom. My issue is that you have so many people that vote against their own best interests. And even in Florida with Rick Scott, there was no fraud or anything. You have George Santos in New York. The New Yorkers voted this man in the office.
Right.
And so many people are still walking around saying they wish Trump was still in office. And it's just mind-boggling because it's state after state. So, I don't know where we go from here, considering people, even women with their rights being stripped away, still voting the way they vote.
Yeah, it is. It's extremely problematic, Malcolm. When Thomas, I'm forgetting his last name. The guy who wrote "What's the Matter with Kansas," Thomas Frank. When he wrote that book, he was seriously asking the question, what's the matter with Kansas? And it wasn't just the simple racism explanation that it is in some other parts of the state, apparently, because large parts of the state that were just all white were still voting to basically commit suicide with Republican policies. That's obviously a piece of it, but these people have been so lied to. They have so believed this myth. We had the author on yesterday of The Big Myth, Naomi Oreskes, this myth that the free market will solve all problems. We just need to leave it to the free market and individual philanthropy, that'll solve the problem. They've so bought into this that they're willing to die. I mean, they're willing to see their children die. They're willing to see their neighbors die, on the altar of this so-called free marketplace, or on the altar of not being woke or, awake or whatever. I mean, it's pretty breathtaking, Malcolm. Do you know people like this?
I know people that, yeah, all the above. Like, even in terms of a woman being raped, they're still okay with this, a girl carrying the baby to term. But at the same time, when a baby's born, they want nothing to do with it. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
Right. Yeah, it's incredible. It's just incredible.
So we're talking about a 12-year-old, a child. She's not even legally old enough to work.
Yeah.
So it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Until next time, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. Good talking to you. 22 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. One of the things that has always baffled me is why, after the Mueller report found, after the Mueller investigation found that there were 10 explicit prosecutable cases of Donald Trump committing violations of the law by obstructing justice, that when Merrick Garland came into office, he chose to ignore those. And now I think the statute of limitations has run out on them. I believe it was a 5-year statute of limitations. He had that first year, he could have prosecuted those. Why? Why is it that on October 30th, 2016, Harry Reid, then the head of the Senate Democrats and of the Senate, wrote a letter to Jim Comey saying it's clear that you have in your possession information about the connection between Trump and Russia and are refusing to release it. Yet you rushed out this information that you were going to investigate Hillary Clinton, and there was no there. Why is this? There's a video with the entire letter from Harry Reid over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. A few other things I wanted to share with you here in this first hour, and then we can get into your calls and whatnot. Marjorie Taylor Greene, as I mentioned yesterday, was calling for a national divorce. This was her big tweet. Let's split the union. The East Coast and West Coast can become blue America. The center part of the country and the South become red America. Won't that be cool? I don't know how this works, right? These red states can't survive without the tax revenues from the blue states. Has she thought this through? Well, she went on Sean Hannity's show last night, and this is where you really begin to understand. Malcolm called a few minutes ago, and he was like, these people are voting against their own self-interest, their own best interest. And, everybody, from Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas, decades ago to now, it's like, why? Why are these people? Well, I think here's a clue. When Sean Hannity was interviewing Marjorie Taylor Greene last night, he opened the interview by saying, most people instinctively want this to be the United States of America. How did you get to this point? And then he goes through a bunch of topics about why he thinks people might want to split up. He said, how do you reconcile defund the police and no bail laws with law and order? Well, as if to say Democrats in blue states want to defund the police. No, there's this little handful of people who were shouting that, and their voices got amplified 100,000 times by Republicans, but it's not Democrats who are saying that. It's, officially, the Democratic Party is not in favor of defunding the police. Then he goes on to say, how do you reconcile secure borders with wide open borders? Well, again, another lie. Our borders are not wide open. Our borders are quite secure, actually. And the people who are presenting themselves at the border are presenting themselves at the border. I get it. Republicans like to lie about this to create a crisis, but then he goes on to say, how do you reconcile energy independence with energy dependence and New Green Dealism? As if putting up solar panels and windmills is going to make us dependent on what? The New Green Deal for energy? Another lie. And then he goes on to say, how do you reconcile peace through strength with people who want to gut our defense? Gut our defense? I don't know of any Democrats who want to gut our defense. It's Republicans who are saying, let's stop sending anything to Ukraine, for example. So, surprise, surprise. Over on Fox News, they apparently, according to these revelations from the Dominion lawsuit, Their business model is to lie to their people.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Which, but how would that national divorce work out? That's pretty strange stuff. We'll be right back with your calls. Our book in today's Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Harvey J. Kaye, Professor Harvey Kaye. Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. This is from the introduction. On December 1st, 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, just weeks before he was to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln delivered his annual message to Congress. Lincoln firmly believed that the United States had an historic responsibility to demonstrate to the world that people can govern themselves, make equal rights not just a self-evident truth, but a manifest one, and create a political and economic order in which working people, both white and black, are not compelled to bow to anyone, neither aristocrats nor capitalists. Empowered by tens of thousands of black slaves who were already liberating themselves from bondage by escaping to the Union lines, and increasingly confident that the majority of his fellow Americans would recognize the truth of what he was saying, Lincoln closed his address by calling on them to see that the time had come to remember who they were and what they demanded, or what that demanded. He told them that to save the nation and all that it represented, they must live up to the nation's declared revolutionary purpose and promise, and act to radically enhance American freedom by bringing an end to slavery. This is a quote from Lincoln's address. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We say we are for the Union. The world will not forget that we say this. We know how to save the Union. The world knows we do know how to save it. We, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. We too, end of quote from Lincoln, back to Harvey. We too cannot escape history. Our own struggle to save the nation and the promise it proclaims has begun. Finally, after more than 40 years of fear-driven class war and culture war campaigns against the democratic achievements of generations, the hard-won rights of workers, women and people of color, and the very memory of how they were secured, and now both in the wake of the election debacle of 2016, which gave the presidency to the corrupt, mendacious, racist, sexist, and treacherous demagogue Donald Trump, and continued control of Congress to the formerly conservative but increasingly reactionary Republican Party, and in the face of intensified class and culture war campaigns, we the people have come not only to recognize that American democratic life is in jeopardy, but also to mobilize in hopes of saving it. Millions of us have rallied to the resistance and expressed our democratic fears and desires in action. In the historic Women's March and March for Our Lives of young people, the protests, demonstrations, and legal actions to defend the lives and rights of immigrants and refugees, the Me Too movement to combat sexual assault and harassment, the massive teachers' strikes for higher pay and better funding of public schools in states red and blue, and the enthusiastic canvassing and campaigning for a blue wave to win back Congress in the 2018 midterm elections. But resistance is not enough. The time has come for us to remember who we are and what that demands. The time has come for us to embrace our radical history, the history of how a generation of Americans, high and low, and in all their diversity, not only turned their colonial rebellion into a war for independence, but also imbued American life, whether they all intended it or not, with radical imperative and impulse by declaring a revolutionary promise of freedom, equality, and democracy for all. The history of how generations of radicals and reformers served as the prophetic memory of that promise, and how generations of ordinary men and women, native-born and immigrant, struggled to make real the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to expand not only the we in We the People, but also the powers of the people. And most especially in view of the crises we ourselves face, the history of how our greatest generations confronted and prevailed over the forces that threatened to destroy the nation and bury its revolutionary promise in the 1770s, 1860s, and 1930s and 1940s, not to mention the 1960s, by acting to make the United States, both inspired by Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, and pushing them to go farther than they might otherwise have gone, radically freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before. The time has come to take hold of that history and make America radical again. I've titled this collection of my speeches and essays, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again, for reasons that will become obvious, and yet I cannot help but confess that if I had to title it otherwise, I would have been sorely tempted to use, with full attribution, the title Max Lerner gave to his 1938 work, It Is Later Than You Think, The Need for a Militant Democracy. While it may not seem so, the crisis we face is no less demanding of action, urgent action, than that which confronted his generation. The book Take Hold of Our History by R.B.J. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. And welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. So I got a note from a subscriber to HartmannReport.com. If some subscribers can just reply to the email that goes out every morning, and it comes right back to me. And he says, "Hi Tom, I'm a self-employed home contractor, mostly doing paint and drywall. About 15 years ago, I was referred to an elderly woman who wanted her kitchen re-wallpapered." And then he goes through the story of how he wasn't able to get all this stuff in order to do the job right then and there, and so it took a couple of weeks. And when he came back a couple of weeks later, by the way, he had seen that this woman looked quite pale and she didn't look well, and he suggested that she see her doctor. And she said she'd call her doctor. She refused and said she was going to call her daughter, excuse me. Turns out what happened was she had a heart attack and died. And he said, "I felt terrible and expressed my condolences and admitted my lack of action. I was overwhelmed with grief. Her daughter said not to blame myself. She said Ellen didn't call 911 because she was afraid about the cost of an ambulance and didn't know if her insurance would cover it." Right. It's like this, this is what Republicans are so proud of. It's just, it's breathtaking. It's number one. Number two, Kevin McCarthy. We discussed this briefly yesterday, but I just want to put it back on the table if you want to call and discuss it at all today. If you have thoughts on this, the 41,000 hours of Capitol video, we're now learning that this includes video of safe rooms that we didn't even know existed in the Capitol building, skiffs in the Capitol building, top secret rooms in the Capitol building, hiding places for members of Congress, where the vice president was spirited away, where the Speaker of the House can go during an emergency. All of this stuff is now in the hands of Tucker Carlson and his producers. Tucker Carlson, who is openly embraces Vladimir Putin and Russia, and against the United States. I mean, it's just I'm using this word breathtaking way too much, but I'm lacking adjectives. It's astonishing. Another one I'm using too much. Anyhow, let's pick up your phone calls and see what you think about all these things. I mean, there's so much stuff in the news here. Andre in Chicago. Hey, Andre, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. How you feel today? Thanks for taking a call.
Thank you.
Good. I'm happy to hear that you and your family's okay. Yeah, I want to discuss something with you pertaining to your subject matter. The way I see it, Tom, I feel like if Dominion voting machines is suing Fox News, then all of the stuff that McCarthy turned over them is evidence. And it seems like McCarthy could and should be sued for that, because what happens if they cipher through the stuff and try and mount a defense against Dominion as a result of those tapes? Does it seem something like that seem possible?
You know, that hadn't even occurred to me, that one of the reasons McCarthy gave all that stuff to Fox, I mean, he gave it to specifically Carlson, but, you know, in the larger context, that's Fox, that one of the reasons McCarthy gave all that tape to Fox might be to help them in their Dominion lawsuit. You know, you're way ahead of me, Andre. I had not, it had not even occurred to me. My concern was that, you know, it would be handed off to the Proud Boys, or that Tucker would use it to put together another documentary claiming that January 6th wasn't that big a deal, like his last one, you know, that got some people so upset.
Yeah, it seemed like a conflict of interest to me. Tom, would it be okay if I mention one thing to you? Okay, and I don't want to take the time. Well, you know, they've been pushing this narrative about Joe Biden's age. You know, I wish that somebody would ask the reporter, why aren't they asking the public, is Donald Trump too much of a criminal to run for president? Why are you asking, is Joe Biden too old? You know, they're not saying nothing about Greg Abbott walking, you know, riding around in a wheelchair. But that's just what I want to put that out there in the airways about you know, what do you choose, somebody with old age or somebody that's a criminal? You know, the media should ask that question to the public.
I'm with you, Andre. I'm with you. Thank you very much. Kurt in Akron, Ohio. Hey, Kurt, what's on your mind today?
Well, thank you for taking the call. But first of all, the reason they don't ask if Trump's a criminal is because they're in the pockets of Trump with the corporate media, it seems. Yeah. Also, to defund the police, real quick.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2021, when President Biden became president, he did something called the American Rescue Plan, which had money in it to fund the police during the pandemic.
Yeah, it was hundreds of millions or billions of dollars for police expansion, or for police departments around the country. Yes,
exactly. And not one Republican voted for that. So who's really defunding the police?
Excellent point. Excellent.
Okay, and then the reason I called is I've done Medicaid for 21 years in the state of Ohio.
By done Medicaid, what do you mean?
I've worked in Medicaid for 21 years.
Okay, so you work it's not that you're on Medicaid. You okay, got it.
Okay, sorry, I should have been more clear on that. Thank God John Kasich expanded Medicaid in the state of Ohio, and thank God Mike DeWine did not monkey with it. I do think had Jim Renacci been elected governor last time, we would be in the same position that those states in the South and in Missouri and Oklahoma are in today.
And this is now Sarah Sanders is proudly proclaiming that as of January 1st of next year, you know, what's that, 9 months down the road from now, 10 months down the road from now, she's going to add a work requirement to Medicaid, which will knock as many as half of the people on Medicaid off the rolls.
Exactly. And right now it's based on, but nationwide right now, per the Affordable Care Act, the rule is you have to make, based on your family size and based on your income, and it's going to go up a little bit, at 138% of the federal poverty level, that's when you're eligible for the Medicaid expansion. So right now it's like $1,562.85 for a family of one, and it's going up to like $1,620 in March. So it's not a lot, but these are real working people that are not making it. They can't make rent, they can't buy food or anything like that if they have to pay for this health care. And thank goodness President Biden signed that executive order a year ago saying that medical bills that are $500 or less, I mean, it's a start, will not affect your credit rating.
Right. And ironically, in the Washington Post article about this, they mention that, but they don't credit Biden for that. They credit the rating agencies for it, saying that the rating agencies aren't going to be...
Someone had to sign it. And another thing, too, is prior to that executive order last year, a pregnant woman, she can only be on Medicaid after giving birth 2 months postpartum. Joe Biden expanded that to a whole year after giving birth now.
Wow. I didn't know that.
So, I mean, and that's at 200% of the federal poverty level because you were pregnant and you gave birth, and children obviously are 206% of the federal poverty level. Right. But, you know, I see people who they may have lifestyles that I don't agree with, you know, certain things they do that I wouldn't do. But that's not my job to judge. And the way I see it, and I see it in their faces from time to time, is I now have the tools to get myself clean or get myself healthy so I can go out and get a job and make something of myself so I don't have to be in this situation anymore. And I can actually buy health care or do something. That's what it's there for. And that's what I think these Republicans are lacking, which is why I don't call a Republican a pro-life person. They're more of a pro-birth person because, like that one gentleman said earlier, they don't. It's like once you're born, to hell with you.
Yeah. So just to verify, since you're an expert on Medicaid, just to verify my understanding of this, my understanding is that with original Medicaid, basically, and I realize it varies from state to state, that if you're basically truly indigent, in some states that's making as little as $3,000 a year, down to zero. And disabled or other, in an area where there's just no jobs, then you qualify for Medicaid. But then if you have a job, if you're making money like between $3,000 and that $15,000 or $16,000 a year, you didn't qualify for Medicaid until the Obamacare expansion, and that kind of filled in that hole, because above that you qualify for the Affordable Care Act. Do I understand that correctly?
Right. And when President Johnson first signed it into law in 1965, it was basically you were indigent or you were disabled or you were a minor. And then even that wasn't always the case. And then when Bill Clinton signed the Welfare Reform Act into law, you could only be on for 3 years. You had to find a job within 3 years. Then they passed in 1998, Bill and Hillary Clinton pushed through with Congress, the CHIPS program, which expanded Medicaid for children of working families in 1998. And then that's how it was up until 2014 when the Affordable Care Act went into effect, where in order to be eligible for Medicaid from like 1996 to 2014, you had to be either disabled for 12 months or more, and you had to prove that with what was called a basic medical packet, which was a lot of work.
Right.
You had to have minor children between the ages of birth and the first month of your 19th year. You had to be pregnant, or you had to be elderly, and then even then,
and you had to be broke if you were elderly.
And prior to the Affordable Care Act, at least for the Medicaid expansion part, which is what you were basically talking about in your op-ed, you had to show proof of resources. And then if you had income, also when you were elderly and you had income, as well as disabled and had income through Social Security or whatever, they had what was called a spend down, which you had to spend a certain amount each month in order for your Medicaid to go through. That spend down went away with the Affordable Care Act. So what people would do on the first of the month all the time is they'd go see Dr. ERMD, because that was how they would most likely meet their spend down. So they'd have it for the whole month.
Huh. Interesting. Kurt, thank you so much for the information, the explanations, your expertise, for being kind enough to call in and share it with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for writing your book, The Hidden History of Healthcare.
Oh, you're welcome. That book, just researching that book blew my mind. I'll tell you. Kurt, thank you so much. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We will be right back with more of your calls right after this. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Fair and only slightly unbalanced. I'll be right back with your calls. And welcome back. MJ in Seattle, listening on KBCS. Hey, MJ, what's up?
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I love what you're saying today, and I see fascism always, authoritarian government, as death cults. Mm-hmm. They are death cults. And you said that earlier after I phoned in, but I want to remind you, last Friday, Larry from Los Angeles called in and acknowledged, before he gave us the one, he's always great financial outlook on things, and he wanted to acknowledge highly sensitive people. And I really look forward to hearing from him, because I read in his approach to things and his voice that he is also one of us, a highly sensitive people.
Right.
So he's got a complete brain that he's using all of to know things. And the brain of a conservative has been talked about since Goldwater. And they are left hemisphere. They want to determine what's good and what's bad, and they don't care if they exterminate what they find bad. If it's a drag on my finances, it could be bad enough to do away with. Mm-hmm. Fear, aggression, power, manipulation, all the Machiavellian high points, top 10, are developed in high left brain use.
Yeah.
This good stuff is too, like science,
No, I get it, but I think your point about the dark triad also is my phrase, not yours, is really important. Nana Loves You is a Twitter name, and Nana tweeted this morning in response to my op-ed a meme that I'd like to toss to you for comment, because it starts with where you started with this phone call. Nana writes, "The Republicans are trying to normalize death. It worked for lying, corruption, sexual assault, approving inexperienced judges, racism, theft, crony capitalism, voter suppression, avoiding oversight, extortion, sexism, insider trading, and stupidity. Why wouldn't it work for death?"
Holy cow, that's correct.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? MJ, thank you very much for the call. It's great to hear from you. I do appreciate it. Les in Winnemucca, Nevada. Hey, Les, what's on your mind today?
Oh, that was quite a list you just read off there. I wanted to say that about these tapes that they sent over to Fox News. Why can't the Department of Homeland Security get a judge to get a court order that they can't release anything to anybody that's the sensitive areas or any of that? Why?
Because the Department of Homeland Security doesn't control these tapes. They're controlled by the.
No, but
they're controlled by the Capitol Police, who are under the purview of the Speaker of the House. This is under the division, the separation of powers in the Constitution. Congress controls everything that happens in that building.
I understand that, but when it comes to protecting the country and the people who run the country, they have a right to oversee it.
Les, you are being logical. You are being logical. I agree with you, but the technicality of the law is that only the legislative branch controls those tapes, and the guy who controls that is Kevin McCarthy right now, or at least the House. Les, thank you for the call. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, or one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it. Just some amazing stuff going on over on Fox News. Megan Lapp and David Stevenson have been regular guests across Fox News, and they're claiming to be all worried about whales, all these whales that are dying off the east coast of the United States, arguing that these are the result of the windmills that are out there, right? The ocean wind and the work done to install them. Well, it turns out that Lapp works for an organization whose largest donor is Charles Koch. Whose largest donor is the Texas Public Policy Foundation that gets their money from Charles Koch. And Stevenson works for a group whose largest donor, the Caesar Rodney Institute, is the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. So if you have friends who are watching Fox News and they're concerned about the whales, you might want to let them know what's going on. There's a whole video about it over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. Eric in Fountain Valley, California, listening on Sirius XM. Hey, Eric, what's up?
Hello, Tom. I have a comment about the national divorce of MT minus the G.
Okay.
And this may sound controversial, but when I hear them openly talk about how they want to secede from the country, my thought is, yes, that may be the way to save our country.
Could be. Could be. I am more inclined to think that what is happening is in these, you've got a group of right-wing billionaires and special interests, largely the fossil fuel industry, but other polluting industries, who, and billionaires that they have made, who are trying to, who have over the last 50 years in response to Lewis Powell's memo, have decided to take over the United States. And the way you do that in a democracy is you get the majority of the votes in the bodies that have power. And in this case, that would be the Senate. So how do you seize control of the Senate? Well, there's a bunch of states where media is really cheap. I mean, you know, Montana, Wyoming, you know, you get these low population states and you can buy radio and television stations for cheap. You could buy local newspapers cheap. And so, you know, over a 50-year period, what they've done is they've gone on a binge of building, you know, every single state now has a state policy center. There's a state policy network. This is all funded, you know, in part by the Kochs and other people like them, you know, the whole billionaire, right-wing billionaire network. And they have convinced people in these red states that their identity must be Republican. They've branded, you know, a whole bunch of things that people view as positive values as Republican. I think the solution is not to let go of them, to separate ourselves from them, because frankly, they'll then come into the blue states and try to just replicate their success in the red states. I think the solution is to bring progressive media into the red states, is to fight them with at the level that they've fought us, and flip a couple of these Midwestern states in particular, and maybe even southern states. I think Georgia's on the verge of it. I think Texas is on the verge of it. Flip them from red to blue. And the way you do that is by changing their media landscapes. You've heard this rant before, Eric.
Right.
But,
yeah, sure. I'd like to make one other point.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders was interviewed last night on Alex Wagner's program, and he's written a new book. And he made a point that I think bears repeating. He said that he has been to every state in the country and spoken to many people all over the country, that nobody in the country is in favor of corporations ripping us off, killing us, transferring our wealth to them. They're just very mad about it and somewhat nihilistic, and they don't really know how to fix it.
Right, and he pointed out this is why we got Trump as president, because Trump told the truth about the problem during the campaign, but then made the problem worse as president.
Yeah, and as you point out, the problem is that people are listening to false information, and they're being convinced that their solution is to vote not for the people who are trying to help them, but for the people who are trying to kill them.
That's right. That's right. Or hurt them or rip them off. Yeah, excellent points all. Very well said, Eric, thank you very much. Carol in Valencia. Hey, Carol, what's up?
Hello, Tom. We've had this discussion before, and I agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I believe that we have a unreconcilable divorce facing us, because they have changed the thinking so much. But the thinking, you know, that wonderful book, how the South won the Civil War, and how it has permeated the Western states through the John Wayne, the development of the whole John Wayne.
Right, which John McCain played into, by the way.
Oh,
and that was that whole ethos, and Ronald Reagan did too.
And I really think it's irreconcilable differences, because characterologically, the Southern people are raised. You just look at the Senate.
And yet in any of these red states, Carol, forgive the interruption, we only have 20 seconds. In any of these red states, you're going to find 30-40% of the people are good Democrats. Why abandon them?
Of course. And we have a good board. We split They don't want to have any kind of social services, any Medicare, any environmental. All they want is military and police.
No, not the Democrats in those states. Those are the people you would be punishing. That's my point. Is you would be punishing, folks, like the people from red states who call into this program. I mean that's the thing I struggle with. Carol, thank you for the call. I get your point, and broadly don't disagree with it. But I'm just not willing to sacrifice those good Americans on the altar of, bad billionaires.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Today is America on Fire by Dr. Elizabeth Hinton, the subtitle, The Untold Story of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. I'm reading from the introduction. On a cold Monday at the start of February, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and David Richmond sat down at a whites-only lunch counter at Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina. A waiter refused to serve the young men and suggested they order takeout instead. The four North Carolina A&T students remained at the counter. The store manager approached and asked them to leave. Still, they did not move. A police officer arrived, slapping his nightstick in his hand in an attempt to intimidate. Rather than allow the students' offense against Jim Crow to continue, the manager of the store closed the store for the day. 24 black students returned on Tuesday. Over 50 black students and 3 white students participated in the sit-in on the next day, Wednesday, February 3rd, 1960. News of the protests spread, and soon the sit-in movement had expanded to 55 cities and 13 states. By April, over 50,000 students were involved. Conceived and organized entirely by young people, the sit-in movement ultimately led to the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which was run by activists such as John Lewis and Stokely Carmichael. As a Fisk student, Lewis participated in the sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee, and he would go on to steer the Freedom Riders in the summer of 1961 and speak at the March on Washington in 1963. Carmichael joined the sit-in movement as a high school student and would famously call for Black Power at the SNCC rally in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1966. Together, Lewis, Carmichael, and tens of thousands of other young black Americans signaled that their generation was prepared to risk their lives
for freedom and equality. From Greensboro onward, the sit-ins helped build momentum and support for racial justice. The students in Greensboro engaged in a nonviolent protest to demand full integration, the right to vote, equal educational opportunities, decent jobs, protection against white supremacist terrorism, and an end to police violence. These were the central aims of the civil rights movement more broadly. By the end of the decade, black students at North Carolina A&T State University were still protesting, but now they were destroying property, assaulting police officers, and shooting in the direction of law enforcement, if not coming close to killing cops in self-defense. In May 1969, after black students at Greensboro's James B. Dudley High School were arrested, brutalized, and tear gassed by police during a series of protests against arbitrary disciplinary measures, A&T students came to the teenagers' defense. The confrontations between local police and black high school and college students led authorities to call the National Guard to A&T's campus, unleashing violence and repression that ended in the killing of sophomore Willie Grimes. A pivotal stop on the road to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, by the end of the decade, Greensboro was a site of sustained violence. It was far from unique in this regard. Between 1964 and 1972, but especially between 68 and 72, the United States endured internal violence on a scale not seen since the Civil War. Every major urban center in the country burned during those 8 years. Violence flared up not only in archetypal ghettos, including Harlem and Watts, and in majority black cities such as Detroit and Washington, D.C. It appeared in Greensboro, North Carolina, in Gary, Indiana, in Seattle, Washington, and countless places in between. Every city, small or large, where black residents lived in segregated, unequal conditions. In the North and the South, the East and the West, the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, black people threw rocks and bottles at police, shot at them with rifles, smashed the windows of businesses and institutions, hurled firebombs, and plundered local stores. These events, what we commonly call riots, or what people who are to the left of center sometimes refer to as civil disturbances, caused hundreds of millions of dollars of property damage. Most immediately, they shaped the lives of the store owners whose businesses were destroyed, of the parents who lost their teenage sons to the police, and of the firefighters and cops who were harmed or killed. But ever since, Americans have been living in a nation and a national culture created in part by the extreme violence of the 1960s and the early 1970s. The aftershocks of that era have, at times, taken the form of mass violence to which all Americans have been witness. In Miami in 1980, in Los Angeles in 1992, in Cincinnati in 2001, and in more recent years, in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. The enduring impact of the violence of the 60s and 70s has been felt more regularly and more acutely by black people in American cities who faced new policing practices that emerged under the banner of the war on crime. The routine stop and frisks that attacked people's dignity, the breaking up of community gatherings, the presence of armed, uniformed officers in the hallways of under-resourced public schools, and more. Such strategies help repress mass violence as a regular phenomenon, but they ironically made further riots inevitable. Those strategies remain in place today. The book, America on
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. On the line with us, my buddy Dean Obeidallah, the host of the Dean Obeidallah Show, weekdays 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on SiriusXM Progress Radio Channel 127. He's a columnist for CNN, contributor to the New Republic, and he's got an amazing Substack newsletter that's really worth subscribing to. It's Obeidallah.substack.com, and it's titled, Dean of Radio? No, it's the Dean's Report, right, Dean?
The Dean's Report, exactly.
Yeah,
Thanks.
there you go. I'm looking at it, but the logo didn't print when I printed your newsletter out for some reason. So
when I come on your show, people, because you have a massive audience, and I'm saying that sincerely, of course, People then subscribe to my newsletter, and it's free, of course. So I hope people, and I'm writing more. I've been inspired by you. At first, I was doing once a week. I subscribe to your great newsletter, which comes every day. So now I'm up to about 3 articles a week for free for people, and there's no paywall. The only thing, if you want to join pay, you can do the monthly meeting. We have a meetup with some special guests, but the rest of that, it's just free, and it's a way to reach people and try to inform them, especially if things the corporate media is just missing. Even though I write for the corporate media, they say no to probably 3 out of my 4 pitches. Yeah. And I'm stuck there with ideas that I think need to be covered.
Oh, Substack is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And you have been doing such a great job with this. And I wanted to talk about the content of a couple of your, Dean reports, Dean's reports. Nicky Haley, this one, just the headline, popped my eyeballs. While Nicky Haley was saying there's no racism in America, a white supremacist was being sentenced for intentionally murdering black Americans. How does this work in the Republican Party where, somebody like Nicky Haley, I've heard, Tim Scott say stuff like this too, where the Republican Party gets people of color to come out and say, yeah, there's no such thing as discrimination in America, or it's not a problem anymore, like John Roberts did when he blew up the Voting Rights Act. How does that work?
Well, for different people, different ways. For people who are of color, Nicky Haley or Tim Scott, it's their bargain to move up in a white nationalist party, because the GOP now is an openly white nationalist party. It's team white. We know that. Years ago, maybe you could say that wasn't their core operating principle. Now their DNA is that. There's no denying it. Plus fascism, because they've embraced violence. But there's Nicky Haley last week literally kicking off her campaign, saying racism in America is over, slamming Joe Biden for saying America's a racist country. He never said that, but she lied and said he did. But 700 miles to the north, there's in a courtroom in New York, where I live in upstate New York, there is a white supremacist pleading guilty for the horrific white supremacist terrorist attack he committed last May in Buffalo in a supermarket. And he was pleading guilty, saying, I killed these people because they were black. And he said he was sorry and he was misled. But, Tom, his manifesto, and I'm not being trite, his manifesto reads like a Tucker Carlson show. It literally talks about the Great Replacement theory. It talks about white genocide. It views critical race theory as a way of taking power away from white people. And this matches up perfectly with the mainstream GOP today. So having someone of color say, hey, racism is over, means you don't have to talk about systemic racism anymore. You don't have to teach black history in school. You don't have to talk about any kind of wrongs from the past committed by their white ancestors or just white people in the past. Nothing. It's all done. We moved on. Don't you get it? So, Tom, the beauty of they use Nicky Haley to help whitewash white supremacy. And there's a benefit for her. It's not like she's oblivious. She gets it. Tim Scott gets it. Tim Scott literally talked about being pulled over by the police 7 times in 1 year, following up that with a sentence, but there's no systemic racism in America. Unless it was the same cop all 7 times, that's an example of systemic racism. Being pulled over because you're a black man driving a nice car in 7 different jurisdictions. Yeah. So unless it's a one-on-one, that cop is just going after Tim. That is systemic racism. Tim knows it. He knows the data. Nikki Haley knows the data. Mike Pence is in New Hampshire last month saying systemic racism is a Democratic myth. That's what they're running on in 2024, that there's no systemic racism. It's all done. America's perfect. And then the flip side, Tom, is the greatest victims of discrimination are white people. White conservatives, of course, what they really mean, white conservatives. And polls back that up. 75% of Trump supporters say discrimination against white people is now as big of a problem as against discrimination of people of color. So this is where we are, my friend. It's going to be a white nationalist open 2024 campaign, open white nationalist campaign.
It is truly bizarre. And you recall back, a decade ago when Stephen Colbert had a show on Comedy Central, and one of his shticks was, I don't see color. And literally, one of these Republicans, I don't recall which one. It was just one of many, probably 200 headlines I read yesterday that flew by me, where it was quoting one of these Republicans as saying, I don't see color, and therefore there's no racial problem in America. I mean, it's just, we've gone from satire to people adopting it as if it's true.
And that's the world we live in, because look, and I've written about this, we've talked about this. The data shows there is systemic racism. It's not a myth. If you're black, it's 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than if you're white. If you're black and you're white, the same prior criminal history and you're convicted of a crime, you get a longer sentence if you're black, higher bail if you're black, more use of the death penalty if you're black, harder chance to get probation if you're black. You're pulled over more likely you're black or brown, and then they have your car searched. These are all backed up by data and studies. It's not me. If there was no data, I wouldn't say it was real. It's very much real. They don't want to talk about it. And to me, my view, and I wrote another article for Substack a few weeks ago going, the GOP knows this. They like the inequity. They want the police to commit wrongs, maybe not kill people, but to police the black people and the brown people more harshly than white people. They really want that because they know the data. If they wanted to end it, they can agree on criminal justice reform. They don't. They block it. Just like gun violence. They see what's going on. They won't change the laws because it's acceptable losses.
Right.
Or, children dying are acceptable losses. This GOP is callous and craven I've ever seen. The cruelty is their currency, and they're joyful about being cruel.
Yeah. That was my op-ed today on Substack. It was about how, denying people access to Medicaid is, that Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and these guys are bragging about the fact that they won't give low-income working people in their states access to Medicaid. It's insane. Along those lines, you're another one of your pieces for Substack. You titled "Mike Pence Wants to Repeal and Replace Social Security." Repeal and replace? Did he actually use that phrase?
He said replace. I added the repeal because then it conjures up the ACA.
Right.
But Mike Pence literally said last Thursday on Fox News, he wants to replace Social Security with, quote, a better deal. He said the same thing a few weeks ago in front of rich donors. And today, this morning, was on CNBC saying we have to talk about entitlement reform of Social Security and Medicare. I know McCarthy doesn't want to talk about it, Kevin McCarthy, but we have to. They are coming for Social Security and Medicare. Because, Tom, you talk about Reagan all the time, the famous thing from Reagan, the 9 most terrorizing words, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. Their DNA is not having government help people. So Social Security and Medicare are one of their greatest failures, that they couldn't stop those programs or repeal them through time. And they're both Democratic initiatives, everyone knows. But, Tom, what was stunning to me, Mike Pence literally said, we have to repeal this New Deal program. He used the term New Deal and create a better deal. You're really going after FDR's New Deal. I mean, it's 2023. They are still angry about the New Deal.
And that was 90 years ago. I mean, literally. It was 90
He literally said he wants to end the New Deal and create a better deal. And we know what the New Deal means, and their base knows what it means. I don't think most older Republicans are on board with this, the idea of revamping, significantly ending Social Security and Medicare as we know it. He's not saying end Social Security. He's saying, let's replace it. So there's the repeal and replace. I think I'm being intellectually honest. Yeah. He's saying, let's end it and create a new program. And the program would be that you could invest privately in money markets and hedge funds so their rich donors can make a profit off commissions and then give donations back to the Republican Party.
Right. But you can already do that. I mean, there's nothing stopping anybody from, putting $50 a month out of their paycheck or $100 a month out of their paycheck into the stock market. Not only is there not anything stopping you from doing it, there's all these, Fidelity and Schwab and everybody else out there who are happy to make it easy for you to do it.
Sure, absolutely. But this GOP, they want you to gamble. I mean, I wrote about it in 2006 when Bush did this AAR across the country with people on it going, if we wanted to gamble with our future, we go play the slots.
Right.
The idea of putting your money in the stock market, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But if you bet on the wrong stocks, you could lose your future. And we'll be back to seniors being impoverished, homeless perhaps. And that's what FDR was the genesis of the whole program, Social Security. He talked about the greatest threat to an American shouldn't be old age. And that's what was happening in this country at the time.
Yeah, it absolutely was. The great Dean Obeidallah, he is the host of the Dean Obeidallah Show, weekdays 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on Sirius XM Progress, channel 127. His Substack is titled The Dean's Report, DeanObeidallah.substack.com. You can easily find it. I recommend it. If you subscribe to mine, you can find Dean's through mine. Dean, thanks so much for dropping by. It's always great talking with you.
It's always great having you, being on. It's always great having you on my show as well. So
Back at you. Okay, thanks, Dean.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
16 minutes past the hour. The fascism experiment in Florida continues. I got to tell you about this. It's mind-boggling. And welcome back. Ari in Eureka, California. Hey, Ari, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. A little bit ago, you were talking with some callers about the normalization of death. I think it's already happened. I mean, if you think there were 4 people who were killed at Benghazi, and Republicans lost their minds, 3,000 people killed in 9/11, and the whole country lost their minds. 1 million people die of COVID, no big deal.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah, and good science suggests that at least 300,000 of those people would not have died if Donald Trump had simply left in place mask mandates, until the vaccines were available. Just that simple thing.
Exactly. I'm your local neighborhood shopkeeper, and we are still requiring masks in our shop.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say we have at least 3 people a day refuse to come in because they won't wear a mask.
Yeah, which is stupid. I mean, it's. I'm assuming you offer free masks to people who forgot to bring one.
Free masks at the front door with a big sign. Get your free hospital bill avoidance device here.
Yeah, I haven't gone retail shopping in a long time because I just, for 3 years now, I've, knock wood, right? So far we've kept safe. But when I was in Michigan the weekend before last with my brother's family because his daughter was dying. My daughter and I and my brother spent a couple of hours just walking around downtown Ann Arbor, which is where the medical center is, where his daughter was. When we couldn't visit her, we visited a couple of bookstores and we visited, some shops. I bought a birthday present for Louise. And what I found interesting was, and this is a college town, of course, but it's in Michigan, was that probably a third of the people in all of the stores that we visited, or in most of the stores that we visited, were wearing masks, and probably half the staff in the stores were wearing masks. It was spotty. There was nobody absolutely requiring it, but it was also far more common than, like, here in Oregon. Louise and I went a couple of weekends ago. We went out to Hood River, which is a town about 40 miles from us, that has some just really nice restaurants. It's right on the Columbia River. It's very picturesque. It's kind of a tourist place. Not a single mask. I didn't see, it's entirely red. It's a very, very Republican area. And I didn't see a single mask anywhere. So it's like there's this kind of bifurcation of America going on right now, Ari.
Yeah, a lot of people, I would say most people, are pretending it's over, and it's not remotely over. And what's going to happen when the bird flu hits?
Yeah, well, that is the scary one, because that's got a 52% fatality rate right now, and COVID is 1.4% if you're unvaccinated.
Well, exactly, and they won't be vaccinated against it, assuming we have a vaccine. We hope, and they won't wear their masks because freedom. It's going to be bad. Here
in 1918 or maybe 1919, one of those 2 years of the flu pandemic, right here in Oregon, there was a case that went all the way into the federal court. I don't know if it went to the Supreme Court. I believe it did. About people here in Oregon refusing to wear masks. Masks were mandated during the flu pandemic. And, it was these rural yahoos who were, well, I don't know if they were rural even. They might have been from Portland. But these right-wing yahoos who were like, no, we don't need no stinking mask. Public health, we don't care about public health. Getting people sick, we don't care about getting. Amazing. All right, keep the faith. Thank you. Yeah, good talking to you. Yeah, keep doing what you're doing there in your store. It's marvelous. It's 20 minutes past the hour. We'll continue in just a moment. I got to tell you about this fascism experiment in Florida and Trump's peril from prosecutions right after this break. Right, in just a moment. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. And welcome back. Every time I hear that, I think of the Beverly Hillbillies. Sorry, I hope I didn't just ruin it for you, Sean. Oh, boy. Welcome back. It is 21 minutes past the hour. Ron DeSantis now wants to be able to sue people who say things bad that he doesn't like about him. He wants to be able to sue me, I'm sure. And so he's challenging the Supreme Court from the 60s, as I recall, maybe it was the 50s. It was New York Times versus Sullivan was the case. And this was a case where the Supreme Court ruled that a public figure, a person like Ron DeSantis, cannot sue anybody who says bad things about them because they're a public figure. I mean, you can sue. Ron DeSantis can sue, but he has to prove a couple of things. He's got to prove actual malice, that the person actually intended to harm him, and he's got to prove that the information that they were using to try and harm him was knowingly incorrect or inaccurate, and that they did it with a willful disregard for the truth. Or reckless disregard for the truth, I believe is the phrase from New York Times versus Sullivan. So he has now introduced legislation in Florida that would be the basis for overturning this decision. And Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch are both on the record saying that they want to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. They would like to, Clarence Thomas, I'm sure in particular, would love to be able to sue people who say bad things about him and Ginny. And I'm sure Neil Gorsuch, I mean, there's enough people out there trash talking his now deceased mother. His mother, Ann Gorsuch, was put up as the head of the EPA by Ronald Reagan. And for 3 years, she ran that agency into the ground so bad. I mean, there was so much corruption at the EPA, or she so corrupted the EPA that she was forced to resign in disgrace. And, I guarantee you, Neil Gorsuch would love to shut me up from talking about that. And everybody else who would point that out to you. I mean, so you can find it, of course, on Wikipedia, I'm imagining, any kind of easy search. But this new legislation would blow that up. And what that would do then is it would discourage newspapers and radio stations and television stations from doing any kind of reporting on what the politicians or the billionaires in the state are up to. And how is that not state censorship? I mean, how is that not fascism? This is what fascist states do. Not only that, the bill declares that speech from anonymous sources will be presumed false, so you can no longer quote an anonymous source. It would be presumed false for purposes of a lawsuit. And that if Ron DeSantis sues and wins, he gets his own attorney costs paid for by the person he sued. Brilliant. Meanwhile, new peril for Donald Trump. And this is a fascinating story. This was just published over at Forbes.com. Forbes has been, Forbes is like, the publication for the rich and the well-born, to paraphrase Jefferson. But they have been watching Donald Trump since the 1980s. And because they watch billionaires, they assign people to them. They keep track of what they're doing. And they've got a new article out called Donald Trump has been lying about Trump Tower for decades. And they point out that the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, filed this $250 million civil suit in September against Trump of fraud. And they note, perhaps the district attorney is hoping to turn up additional information. Well, Forbes has some. Since the early 1980s, we have been scrutinizing various aspects of Trump's properties. Our latest look at Trump Tower uncovered these new pieces of potential evidence. 1, property records show that the real estate mogul has been lying about the financial performance of the building since it first opened in 1983. 2, tax and lending documents indicate that Trump lied about the square footage of his office and retail space at the base of the property. Number 3, portions of a 2015 audio recording released here for the first time prove that Trump was personally involved in the efforts to lie about the value of Trump Tower's commercial space. They go on to say, all point to the simple conclusion. The Trump organization lied about the value of its properties to lenders for years, and although multiple people inside the firm participated in these efforts, the person at the center of the deceit was Donald Trump. And they literally take it back to 1978 when Trump started lying about Trump Tower as he was planning on building it. He was lying about the size of it. He was lying about what he was going to get from it. He lied to banks in order to get money to borrow for it. And then when it comes time to pay taxes, he reverses his lies. He says, oh, yeah, this is worth $100 million to the lenders who would give him $100 million. Then he goes to the IRS. He goes, it's only worth $42 million. I mean, these are just made-up numbers, but by way of illustration, the actual numbers are even more bizarre. They're even more bizarre. And now Forbes is no slouch. Forbes is taken seriously by people, particularly in New York City, kind of the financial capital of the world.
So when Forbes comes out and says Donald Trump has been lying since 1978 and lying in a way that is criminal since 1983, I think this is one more nail in the coffin of the Trump empire. Now, Jared and Ivanka have made their billion by sucking up to the Saudis and you know, probably Trump handing off top secret documents to the Saudis. Certainly Jared went over there, and immediately after he apparently revealed top secret information about our friends in the Saudis, MBS started arresting people.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And now Jared's got MBS's $2 billion. But what about Don Jr.? What about Eric? Are they going to be left out in the cold? Our Thom Hartmann University book review. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Recurring Crises of American Democracy, 4 Threats. I think 4 Threats is the actual title, by Susan Bettler and Robert C. Lieberman. And this is from my well-dog-eared copy. I have read this book cover to cover. It's an amazing book. This is from the introduction. When the president used his power to target immigrants, the press, and his political opponents, the sheer overreach of his actions shocked many citizens. Tensions among the nation's political leaders had been escalating for years. Embroiled in one intense conflict after another, both sides had grown increasingly distrustful of each other. Every action by one camp provoked a greater counter-reaction from the other, sometimes straining the limits of the Constitution. Fights and mob violence followed. Leaders of the dominant party grew convinced that their only hope for fixing the government was to do everything possible to weaken their opponents and silence dissent. The president signed into law provisions that made it more difficult for immigrants, who tended to support the opposition, to attain citizenship, and mandated the deportation of those who were deemed dangerous or who came from, quote, hostile, end quote, nations. He then put his pen to a law that would allow for the prosecution of those who openly criticized his administration, such as newspaper publishers. The year just described was not 2017 or 2018. Rather, it was 1798, when President John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Act. His allies in Congress, the Federalists, argued that these measures were necessary in anticipation of a possible war with France to protect the country from internal spies, subversive elements, and dissent. The Federalists disapproved of immigrants, viewing them as a threat to the purity of our national character. They particularly disliked the Irish, the largest immigrant group, because they largely favored their political opponents, the Republicans, and sympathized with the French. Or as one Federalist congressman put it, there was no need to, quote, invite hordes of wild Irishmen, nor the turbulent and disorderly of all the world, to come here with a basic view to distract our tranquility, end quote. Critics of the new laws raised their voices in protest. The Republicans charged that they amounted to barefaced efforts to weaken their faction, which happened to include most Americans not of English heritage. 2 leading Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, went so far as to advise state governments to refuse to abide by the Sedition Act, resolving that it was unconstitutional. Political conflicts boiled over into everyday life. Federalists and Republicans often resided in different neighborhoods and attended different churches. Federalists, centered particularly in New England, prized their Anglo-American identity, and even after the Revolution, they retained their affinity for their mother country. Republicans saw themselves as cosmopolitan, cherishing Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality, and they championed the French Revolution and held disdain for Britain. By 1794, partisans in urban communities were holding separate 4th of July ceremonies. Republicans read aloud the Declaration of Independence, penned by the founder of their party, Thomas Jefferson, as evidence that independence had been their own achievement, while the Federalists offered toasts to their leader, President George Washington. The Republicans viewed themselves as the party of the people. One prominent politician among them chided the Federalists for celebrating not, quote, we the people, but, quote, we the noble, chosen, privileged few, end quote. To many people at the time, the Alien and Sedition Acts bore an unsettling resemblance
to the kind of government overreach that spurred them to fight a war for independence just a few decades earlier. The acts comprised 4 laws, 3 of which placed restrictions on immigrants and appeared to be a strategic attempt to shape the electorate by excluding potential voters for the opposition in order to tip the scales of power. The 4th, the Sedition Act, made it illegal to publish, quote, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States or either House of Congress of the United States with intent to defame or to bring them into contempt or disrepute, end quote. By denying freedom of speech and freedom of the press, it outlawed criticism of the government and deprived citizens of the opportunity to become more fully informed by hearing alternative points of view. The measures gave the president power to exert control over Americans' lives in ways removed from congressional authority and therefore less accountable to popular control. Some state governments outright refused to abide by the new federal law, intensifying divisions. And on the streets, mock violence, the burning of effigies, was swiftly transformed into the genuine article as politically motivated beatings and open brawls proliferated. In one case, on July 27, 1798, Federalists in New York marched up Broadway singing God Save the King just to antagonize the Republicans. The latter responded by singing French Revolutionary songs. Soon the singing contest gave way to violence as fighting ensued. Watching the growing chaos and divisions, Americans of all stripes worried that their experiment in self-government might not survive the decade. They feared that monarchy would reassert itself, aristocracy would replace representative government, or some states might secede from the Union, causing its demise. The early beginnings of democracy in the United States were fragile, even at a time when some of the Constitution's framers themselves held public office. The book Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. Our podcast, The Hartmann Report, is absolutely free and available wherever fine podcasts are available. And the entire 3-hour podcast is available over at thomhartmann.com. And welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour, picking up your... Oh, by the way, Donald Trump is... this is so sad. He's going to East Palestine, Ohio today. How does he get away with this? He's the guy who deregulated the railroads in 2017. I mean, this... Where's the detail on this? Trump is returning to the scene of the crime. I mean, this is, well, I'll get into that in the next hour. We'll hold off on that for the moment. And let's pick up your phone calls. Mark in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
So, Tom, I'm wondering, I know when a new Congress starts, they swear to uphold the Constitution and all that stuff, but right. I'm wondering, for the purposes of things like videotape and cameras in the House or in Congress, I mean, don't they sign a non-disclosure agreement as far as where those cameras are and something like that to the effect to keep it private so that in the event of something like an insurrection, that information is not allowed to be disclosed to anybody?
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, no. It's, the cameras are the property of the Capitol Police. The Capitol Police operate under the Sergeant at Arms by and large. The Sergeant at Arms reacts to, of the House, responds to the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House has control over that. The thing that baffles me is why Mitch McConnell doesn't have a say in this, because the Senate is supposed to be the kind of, equal body to the House. But apparently all of the security for the Capitol falls under the purview of the Speaker of the House. And I'm not sure how that happened or when that happened, but that's the case. And so Kevin McCarthy decided to give the secret identity of the safe rooms and the secret locations of the SCIFs and the secret places where vice presidents and presidents can hide in the event of an emergency, all to Tucker Carlson, a guy who loves, Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin.
Well, I'm just wondering if Merrick Garland is going to be putting up an investigation on this, because, it's never been done before in the history of this country, as far as I know, where the speaker is given that type of very, privileged information to a private entity.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the Democrats in the Senate are going to put an investigation together about this too. I wonder. I mean, it'd be nice if you do talk to any senators coming up on your show.
That would be a good idea. We need some Democratic senators who are kind of the Democratic version of Jim Jordan, and I'm not sure. I mean, there are senators who have done some really good investigations. Sheldon Whitehouse has been on this show many times, is one of them, who has done just some great work. But we don't have, the flamethrowers among the Democrats in the Senate. I mean, it's a more genteel body and all that sort of thing. But hey, on the Republican side, they've got Josh Hawley, and they've got their own crazies, Rick Scott. Apparently it's not a crime, Mark, and in fact, I retweeted. I believe it was Adam Schiff. It might have been Eric Swalwell. I'm not sure. I had to go back and look at my Twitter feed, but no. I think it was Jamie Raskin. I retweeted Jamie Raskin's tweet a little while ago. Talking about the danger of this. There's a very real danger, whether it's a crime or not. Probably not.
I just wonder if there's any monetary transaction between Kevin McCarthy and Tucker Carlson or Fox News. I mean, that's a legitimate question. I mean, why would he just give that information to one person?
Well, it's not. Sometimes barter works to benefit without having to exchange cash. The more Kevin McCarthy can suck up to Fox News, that helps Fox News because they've got a friend who's got control of the House of Representatives. The more that he does that, the more likely Fox News is to suck up to Kevin McCarthy on the air, which helps Kevin McCarthy with his fundraising and with his reelection and with the power that he holds. So it's a symbiotic relationship, Mark, but I don't think it's going to go beyond that. Mark, thank you for the call. Kevin in Durham, North Carolina. Hey, Kevin, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. So Marjorie Taylor Greene wants a national divorce, which I think is, ridiculous on its face. But the thing that I found most offensive and just abhorrent was her saying, well, if Democrats from blue states want to move to red states, that's fine. You can move here, you can live here, work here, but maybe we don't let you vote for 5 years. Which I was just, it just bears repeating once again. These people don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in we the people. I don't know what you call what they believe.
They are proud of their fascism, Kevin. They are proud of their fascism.
Well, I'm just waiting for her to say, for her to just come out and say, I don't think black people should be able to vote. Yeah. I mean, she's right there. I mean,
I'm guessing when she said if people want to move here from blue states, that was what was in the back of her mind. I mean, she is from Georgia after all. I lived in that state for either 11 or 13 years. I have to go back and count on my fingers, but it's a pretty racist state.
Well, and what's ironic is that she's from a state that now has 2 Dem senators.
Yeah.
It's just, and the fact that Fox News is now platforming this, it's just insane.
Yeah. I don't disagree, and it's anything to distract you from the fact that Republicans want to take away Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. They want to do away with the minimum wage. They want to do away with child labor laws. I'm not making this stuff up, by the way.
You're right.
It's like this is the GOP, and so let's change the subject. Let's talk about a national divorce. Right. How's that going to work? There has never been a successful nation state based on libertarian principles, which is basically what the Republican Party is pitching these days. Dancing to the tune of the old David Koch platform from 1980. And it won't work for them. I mean, it doesn't work for them right now. And that which was the essence of my op-ed today at Hartmann Report, which is that in these 11 states controlled by Republicans where they have not expanded Medicaid, you have the highest levels of medical debt in the nation. And because of that, you have the lowest credit scores. And because of that, you've got the highest cost to buy a car, the highest cost to buy a house for those people who have that medical debt. And it's just, and they're all being punished because Republican governors and Republican legislatures think that it's wrong for big government to pay for the health care of low-income working people. After all, they're the takers, not the makers. I mean, it's just nuts. Kevin, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Joe in Toronto, Canada. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, at the risk of sounding like a condescending Canadian, I've been struck by the theme today of the pathological utilitarianism and the abject materialism that is the modern GOP. And I'm just
well, you got some of that in Canada, Joe.
Oh, listen, I'm in Ontario here, and we're privatizing the healthcare right and left. So let me tell you, it's a bad scene. But I was reminded of a conversation you had or you shared from a couple of years ago that has stuck with me all these years, because it was a conversation that you shared about someone living in Florida. It was post the peak of COVID, but hurricane season was coming in, and people were being advised to evacuate and so on, and everybody was diligently following plans and boarding up everything. And some left-winger reached out to all these people dutifully following these orders and said, "What are you guys doing, you right-wingers? Where's your freedom? Where's your pushback? Where's your..."
You're doing what big government tells you to do.
But the answer, which stuck with me until this day, was that whoever was asked that question said, "Oh no, this is property. That's different, or even worth more than personhood."
Yeah.
And I just remember that. I've never forgotten that conversation that you had a couple of years ago.
Interesting. I don't recall it specifically, but that is, I mean, property over people is the essence of the certainly the libertarian message, and sadly many of the Republicans' messages. Amazing. Joe?
That's all.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, that's all.
Okay, thanks a lot, Joe. Good to hear from you, and thanks for the report from Canada. Rob in Mesa, Arizona. Hey, Rob, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Hey, yeah, I think the Democrats just have to make a very simple rally cry. They basically have to come up and just say, look, we are going to be the people who change the laws against corporate greed. We are going to, have a rebellion against corporate greed, and basically take the torch from Bernie Sanders and run with it.
Yeah.
You can use this rally cry to recruit at the state and federal level and say, look, you elect us in, and this is kind of a moonshot. This isn't going to happen overnight, but we want to change the laws that say corporations are not people and money is not free speech. And start with that mantra. Remember Occupy Wall Street? That was a big movement. Just play off of that.
Here's the problem, Rob.
And I think with you,
every time Democrats start, try to come out and talk about, what they're going to do or what could be done or what should be done or propose anything rational and reasonable, Republicans come out and figure out some way to scream very loudly, but trans people, but black people, trigger the white racists and the homophobes, so that suddenly the conversation becomes, but immigrants and the border. And so suddenly that becomes the conversation, and we've completely lost track of the conversation that we were having about the Republican Party and the terrible things that they're doing, or about the good stuff that the Democratic Party wants to do. I mean, they've got this handful of volatile issues that they constantly push to us.
Yes, they're great at marketing the straw man argument.
Right.
But we need to just stand strong and say, look, until you get the money out of government, nothing's going to change. If you're feeling miserable, it's because of the corporate greed.
Yeah.
And this rebellion has to go against the corporations. Not all corporations are corrupt.
I think we also have to start
us a lot of money.
Right. I think we also have to take a lesson from Lee Atwater and start working the refs. We need to start calling out media when they fall for these Republican talking points and these Republican distractions, and just point out, that's a lie, that's a distraction, or that, work the refs. Rob, thanks for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
That was an actual campaign that Lee Atwater rolled out back in the early 80s, as I recall, during the Reagan administration. And it worked. It worked. And welcome back. Lori in Ocala, Florida. Hey, Lori, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I just wanted to be the first one to say I want a divorce. I definitely want a divorce.
From?
A la MTG.
Okay.
If the GOP wants to secede from the union, I think the Dems should get all over that. Let's get flyers like Biden did. Remember, he put out flyers in the chairs at an event in Florida, telling everybody what Rick Scott's Medicare plan was.
Right. Well, it was actually a copy of Scott's plan. Yes.
It was literally a copy of the plan in the flyer. We need to print out flyers that identify what blue states offer and what red states don't. Flyers. Make sure that the media gets them. Everybody, every single congressperson, every single senator, when they get on any media, they need to whip out the flyer. This is the lack of coverage in all 11 states for those that fall into the gap.
Yeah.
So that if your income fails, and then run more right for less. You can work with no unions. Your hospitals are bad. They're closing up. Red states give less to the government than the government gives them. So red states, blue states stop contributing. Don't forget one thing. MLK was all about the poor. And we don't care if you're black. We don't care if you're Muslim. We don't care if you're, Irish, Asian. We do not care. We want people to have a good life. We don't say, come on over here, you black people.
No, I get your point. Lori, I'm sorry, your phone is, I think you got me on speaker, and it's so hard to hear that I'm going to end this right now. But what I did understand of what you were saying, I thought that your point was well taken. Michael in Anchorage, Alaska. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Hey, I have a question about this Kevin McCarthy fiasco about Tucker Carlson getting information that should be, I would think it would be a security breach.
Right, exactly.
So if I was to fill out a Freedom of Information Act form and submit my wanting to know all about the Capitol, do you think they'd give it to me?
I doubt it.
You think that? Yeah, I know, and that's what I'm talking about. It blows my mind. Anyway, that's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's. Have you ever filed a FOIA request?
I have not.
Yeah.
But I think that I am. I think I'm ready to.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah, I have never done it either, and I was poking around last week on the FBI's website because I was curious about some information that I thought they may have, and discovered that it's really hard to get information about people from the FBI. You pretty much have to be the person, and you have to, even then all they'll give you is what they call your rap sheet.
Yeah, you have to prove who you are also.
Right.
I'll tell you a story back when COVID first started, is I was under the knife in February of 20. And they took out a part of my lungs because I had asbestos cancer. So I couldn't work, and I'm applying for the assistance, right? It took a year for me to prove to the government that I am me.
Yeah, it's insane. Michael, thank you for the call. I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. So you don't think generally of community gardening and cancer and heart disease prevention in the same thought, in the same sentence. But sure enough, this was published in the journal Lancet Planetary Health, a study that was funded by the American Cancer Society, the first ever randomized control trial of the effects of community gardening. And what they did was they started a garden. This was in Denver. It was 291 non-gardening adults, average age 41. And they gave them half of the group. They gave them a garden plot and some seeds and seedlings and an introductory gardening course. And what they found was by the fall that those people who were doing the gardening had increased their fiber consumption by 1.4 grams a day, 7%, which is substantial. And they believe that this will help them with everything from diabetes to certain cancers. It's absolutely a fascinating study. There's a whole video about it over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. 51 minutes past the hour. Picking up your calls. Miguel in Frederick, Maryland. Hey, Miguel, what's on your mind today?
Hey, what's on my mind is that I've been listening for years, and I've been listening to everybody else, and I kind of believe this too. What I realize is that when people say people are voting against their interests, they're actually not. Their interest is to maintain the white supremacy and their place. It goes back to Lyndon B. Johnson, where as long as there's someone that they can lower than them, these people are more than willing to maintain this stuff. Right. Also, I do believe that even when they cut Social Security and Medicare, it's a wink and a nod. It's not, they feel that they're going to continue to get their benefits. It's all the other people, the black people, the Hispanics, the transgender people, all the people that they don't like, that they will not get their benefits. And also, it's against the whole thinking, this Mitt Romney thing is that I'm tired of people trying to find the humanity in these people. We've been living 40 years, especially with Jimmy Carter dying. If we would have just did what Jimmy Carter did in 1980, I believe, when he lost to Reagan, the nation would be so far better, and we'd be untied to all these autocratic governments globally. So they want to keep us there, and there's people that like this. Like, there's something wrong with them. And I'm going to tell you, when you talk about Ron DeSantis' education thing, the whole guide of their education is to make it cruel so this can continue. Thank you for listening to me, but I'm tired of it. Yeah. This next generation is not the past generation. And our parents are even telling us, you're not going through the same shit we go through. Yeah. So
sorry, Miguel, I'm sorry. We can't use that language on the air, so I got to cut you off. But everything else, spot on. Well said. Bill in Sierra Blanca, Texas. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I was listening to you on the app regarding New York Times versus Sullivan defamation, slander, and libel lawsuits.
Right.
And, as you know, Kelsey Warren is suing Beto O'Rourke, claiming he's not a public figure, which he is,
right,
as we all know. But listen, Tom, I have some interesting short story and experience. In 1998, along with Sony TriStar and the good guy, one of the good guys.
Bill, if I could interrupt you real quick, can you get your mouth closer to the microphone? You can keep me on speaker, but just put your mouth right up against the microphone so I can hear what you're saying. Yeah, thank you. Now keep on.
In 1998, Tom, I, along with Sony TriStar and a good guy from the EPA, Hugh Kaufman, we were sued by a sewage removal and dumping company, Merco Joint Ventures, for libel, slander, and business disparagement in federal court. Merco was bringing a third of New York City's dewatered sludge to my home and spreading it on 60,000 acres of land. Very toxic thing, and it stunk really bad. It was on TV Nation, and the company got Joe Tidings, former senator, to sue us in federal court. Well, the federal court ruled against us, but to make a long story short, the most conservative appellate court in the country, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, ruled a year later, after the lower decision, that Merco, the sludge dumping company, was a public figure and did not in any way prove any actual malice by me, who was on the show, TV Nation, Michael Moore's, the EPA's Hugh Kaufman, or the production company Sony TriStar. In addition, lastly, the Supreme Court has ruled like this type of lawsuits are to limit public participation. The Denver College of Law called them SLAP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation.
Right.
And the Supreme Court has also ruled that those are illegal, frivolous, and can be sued by the defendants.
Right.
Back.
Depending on the state, yeah, you've got these anti-SLAP laws in many states, mostly blue states. But yes, and we need a federal anti-SLAP law, I believe. But that's great news, Bill. It's a good story. That is, however, I think we need to confront this. This is exactly what Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas and Ron DeSantis now want to overturn.
Well, all they have to do is look at the most conservative court in the country, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, that ruled in our case. And by the way, Oprah Winfrey, when she was sued by the cattle growers over her show about beef, she used ours as our case as a part of her defense.
Right.
So the Supreme Court, anyone opposing this should say, look, your own Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and others have.
That doesn't mean they're going to stay there, Bill. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that the Fifth Circuit Court is going to continue to hold that position. Once it becomes Republican doctrine, these courts have a way of changing their minds.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying it could be used.
Yeah, I would hope so. I would very much hope so. I'm really concerned about this trend toward fascism, this trend against a free press in the United States, this trend against controlled information, this trend of using the power of great wealth to destroy average people and journalists who call out great wealth, that has seized the GOP over the last 5, 6, 7 years now. And you got Donald Trump out there just openly calling for this kind of stuff as well. But Bill, great story. Glad to hear about it. And thank you. Thank you very much for adding to our information database here, as it were, making us smarter. Kathay Feng is going to be with us about Shelby County v. Holder 10 years later. Stick around. This is going to get interesting.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at ThomHartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at ThomHartmann.com. So check them all out at ThomHartmann.com and HartmannReport.com.
We take life back!
Book today for the Thom Hartmann Book Club is A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II by Sonia Purnell. This is from the prologue. France was falling. Burned out cars, once strapped high with treasured possessions, were nosed crazily into ditches. Their beloved cargoes of dolls, clocks, and mirrors lay smashed around them and along mile upon mile of unfriendly road. Their owners, young and old, sprawled across the hot dust and were groaning or already silent. Yet the hordes just kept streaming past them, a never-ending line of hunger and exhaustion, too fearful to stop for days on end. 10 million women, children, and old men were on the move, all fleeing Hitler's ranks, pouring across the border from the east and the north. Entire cities had uprooted themselves in a futile bid to escape the Nazi blitzkrieg that threatened to engulf them. The fevered talk was of German soldiers stripped to the waist in jubilation at the ease of their conquest. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of the dead. The babies had no milk, and the aged fell where they stood. The hordes drawing overladen old farm carts sagged and snarled in their sweat-drenched agony. The French heat wave of May 1940 was witness to this, the largest refugee exodus of all time. Day after day, a solitary moving vehicle weaved its way through the crowd with a striking young woman at the wheel. Private Virginia Hall often ran low on fuel and medicines, but still pressed on in her French Army ambulance toward the advancing enemy. She persevered even when the German Stukas came screaming down to drop 110-pound bombs onto the convoys all around her, torching the cars and cratering the roads. Even when fighter planes swept over the treetops to machine gun the ditches where women and children were trying to take cover from the carnage. Even though French soldiers were deserting their units, abandoning their weapons and running away, some in their tanks, tanks, even when her left hip was shot with pain from continually pressing down on the clutch with her prosthetic foot. Now, at the age of 34, her mission marked the turning point after years of cruel rejection. For her own sake, as much as for the casualties she was picking up from the battlefields and ferrying to the hospital, she could not fail again. There were many reasons why she was willingly jeopardizing her life far from home in aid of a foreign country when millions of others were giving up. Perhaps foremost among them was that it had been so long since she had felt so thrillingly alive. Disgusted with the cowardice of the deserters, she could not understand why they would not continue the fight. But then she had little to lose. The French still remembered sacrificing a third of their young menfolk to the Great War, and a nation of widows and orphans were in no mood for more bloodshed. Virginia, though, intended to go on the road, wherever the battle took her. She was prepared to take whatever risks, face down any dangers. Total war against the Third Reich might perversely offer her one last hope of personal peace. Yet even this was as nothing compared with what was to come in a life that drew out into a Homeric tale of adventure, action, and seemingly unfathomable courage. Virginia Hall's service in the France of summer 1940 was merely an apprenticeship for a near-suicide mission against the tyranny of the Nazis and their puppeteers in France. She helped to pioneer a daredevil role in espionage, sabotage, and subversion behind enemy lines in an era when women barely featured in the prism of heroism, when their part in combat was confined to the supportive and the palliative, when they were just expected to look nice and act obedient and let the men do the heavy lifting. Women or men were confined to staying at home and leading often narrow, unsatisfying lives. The fact that a young woman who had lost her leg in tragic circumstances broke through the tightest constrictions and overcame prejudice and even hostility to help the Allies win the Second World War is astonishing. That a female guerrilla leader of her stature remains so little known to this day is incredible. Yet that is perhaps how Virginia would have wanted it. She operated in the shadows, and that was where she was happiest, even to her closest allies in France. She seemed to have no home or family or regiment, merely a burning desire to defeat the Nazis. They knew neither her real name nor her nationality, nor how she had arrived in their midst. Constantly changing in looks and demeanor, surfacing without notice across whole swaths of France, only to disappear again as suddenly, she remained an enigma throughout the war, and in some ways after it, too. Even now, tracing her story has involved 3 solid years of detective work, taking me from the National Archives in London, the Resistance Files in Lyon, and the parachute drop zones in the Haute-Loire, to the judicial dossiers of Paris and even the white marble corridors of CIA headquarters at Langley. My search led me through 9 levels of security clearance into the heart of today's world of American espionage. I have discussed the pressures of operating in enemy territory with a former member of Britain's special services and ex-intelligence officers from both sides of the Atlantic. I've tracked down files that were missing and discovered that others remain mysteriously lost or unaccounted for. I have spent days drawing diagrams matching dozens of code names with scores of her missions, months hunting for remaining extracts of these strange disappeared papers, years digging out forgotten documents and memoirs. The book A Woman of No Importance by Sonia Purnell.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So back in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which included provisions that required federal oversight when states wanted to make changes in who could vote, how people voted, things having to do with voting, drawing congressional districts, gerrymandering, all these kinds of things that might have a racial impact. It was a wise piece of legislation, an important piece of legislation, and it got blown up 10 years ago this week
by 5 Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court in the case called Shelby County v. Holder. Kathay Feng is with us, the National Redistricting Director of Common Cause. CommonCause.org is the website. Kathay, Kathaycc is Kathay Feng's Twitter handle. Kathay, welcome to the program. Tell us about, well, let's start with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the provisions that got blown up by the Supreme Court when John Roberts essentially said there's no more racism in America.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty incredible decision, considering that even today we see example after example of discrimination at the polls, intentional and effect of laws that have been passed that restrict voting ability of minority communities. But what happened in 2013, 10 years ago, was we had the Voting Rights Act that had multiple types of protections. And the way that I like to simplify it is to think of it as you had a fire alarm that detected and allowed you to respond to smoke before the fire happened. That was Section 4 and 5. You had a fire extinguisher. If the fire happens, we can put it out. And then you have the fire department. Sometimes that was the courts. Sometimes it was the Department of Justice. And what essentially the Shelby County versus Holder did was it said, let's get rid of the fire alarm. So even if you have evidence that there is going to be a disparate impact because of a law that's just been adopted, you cannot stop it from going into effect. And taking away that protection before the harm has happened is what Shelby County did. So now what we have is you've got to let the fire happen before you can go in to extinguish it. And in a very dangerous case that's before the Supreme Court this term, Moore v. Harper, there's a possibility that the court could say, we don't even want the fire department to exist. So the very entities that might come in the instance of a finding that there is discrimination in the laws, now no longer can correct that problem through more reactive actions.
Now, John Roberts and Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas and their buddies on the court didn't just come out and say, hey, we're all in favor of white supremacy in America. And, the states that are governed by a political party or by, individual governors and legislators who also are all in favor of white supremacy are just fine. We're just happy with that. What possible rationalization did Roberts and crew use to blow this up?
A piece of this is to say that Congress in 1965, when they adopted the Voting Rights Act, had extensive hearings to identify problems that had existed in states where states had consistently and historically adopted laws that discriminated against voters of color. And prevented them from being able to exercise their vote in a way that was meaningful, where their votes would count just like those. They wanted to believe, and I think that they used the election of President Obama as their justification, that we are in a post-racial era. If we can elect a Black president to office, it must mean that we are past the racism that is built into our institutions and our systems. And so they justified it by saying there's insufficient evidence to keep holding these states that have been historically found to have committed racial discrimination when it comes to voting laws, hold them accountable in that proactive way. And we see even now in states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, every chance that they get, they will adopt laws that disparately harm voters of color. So it isn't a past thing, but I think it is an attempt by the court to say that we're past racial discrimination and essentially become an activist court in obliterating a law that had been adopted by Congress in a bipartisan manner.
Can you identify specific harms that this decision 10 years ago by these Republicans on the Supreme Court have caused?
Sure. Well, the lead up to that 2013 case was incredibly important because people remember the context, right? In 2008, President Obama was elected, and then a whole slew of states started adopting restrictive voting laws that try to eliminate the ability for nonprofit groups to get out there and register people to vote, like League of Women Voters, right? That restricted the ability for people to vote if they couldn't show a certain kind of identification. So in Texas, for instance, if you had a gun owner's permit, that was allowed. But if you had a permit, a identification that had been issued by the University of Texas, UT Austin, that was not allowed, right? So clearly it was balanced towards one kind of voter over another in a very partisan way. And those kind of voter restrictions were held in abeyance in 2012 when the Voting Rights Act was still going strong. And after 2013, when the Supreme Court obliterated Section 4 and 5, the fire alarm, right, of the Voting Rights Act, those laws were allowed to go into effect. And so we saw in 2014 the restrictions that really turned away thousands and thousands of voters because they couldn't jump through all the hurdles that had been newly put into place by the states that didn't want them voting.
So I realize the For the People Act, H.R. 1, would have addressed many of these issues. Is there, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe that to be the case. Is there, I'm assuming Congress, at least Democrats in Congress are going to continue trying to fight that fight. Are there other battles? I know that you guys are also non-state respondents in Moore v. Harper. I don't know how that ties into this. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. Multiple ways that we can respond. So obviously Congress has two bills before it. One of them is right behind me, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act reenactment, right? But also the what is now called the Freedom to Vote Act. Both of those would protect, update, modernize our voting rights laws to ensure that people have the ability to cast ballots in a way that is current to 2023, right? So people are busy, and sometimes you need to have options to vote. And walking to a polling place is not the only way that people can now vote. They can vote by mail. They can cast a ballot, in early days before leading up to Election Day. So protecting the ability for people to have an accessible right to the ballot is important. And that's what this combination of bills would do. But the other thing that we can do is fight it in the courts. And so in Moore v. Harper, this is a case that comes out of North Carolina, which has always been ground zero for redistricting battles. We've seen a lot of past examples of the lines being drawn to gerrymander to hurt Black communities, right? And certainly to gain a party advantage for the majority party. And in this instance, the state Supreme Court said that their state constitution protected against both racial discrimination as well as partisan gerrymandering. And so they ordered new lines to be drawn. Those new lines were drawn. And the state legislature kind of had a toddler's fit and went to the Supreme Court and said, not only was the state Supreme Court wrong, but they shouldn't even be allowed to correct their actions in court. So they're wanting to take away, as I said before, the ability of a fire department to be able to respond to the fire. They want to take away the judicial branch out of the process of redistricting and out of the process of reviewing any legislative action when it comes to making federal election laws.
So, wow, that's remarkable. So I guess we just need to get in line here with commoncause.org. You guys are fighting this, so that people can go to commoncause.org and get more information. Kathay Feng, thank you so much for dropping by and sharing all this information with us. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me and covering all of these important issues for your viewers to learn more.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is really important stuff. This is critical to the future of our democracy. Kathay, thank you. commoncause.org. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So why is Donald Trump visiting East Palestine? Is he returning to the scene of the crime? I'll tell you about that after the break. And welcome back. Chris in San Diego. Hey, Chris, what's up?
Hey, Tom, I want to hit on what you were saying earlier. The problem here is the lack of a fourth state. It was why it was so important. We're not questioning those reporters. Good example right here in San Diego is last month the rate for gas literally tripled, and everybody was freaking out. And I keep seeing them on the news interviewing SDG&E, and they say, oh, we just sell it to our customers at cost. We're not making any money on that. But what the reporter's not asking them is, wait a minute, you're buying it from your parent company, and they make the money on it.
You're talking about natural gas here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amazing. Yeah, I get it, Chris. I think your phone just croaked, but I totally get it. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that story. It's a grim one. Lydia in Phoenix. Hey, Lydia, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I've just got a weird thought. Possibly you'll correct me on it, but I'm thinking that Marjorie Taylor Greene used the word divorce over secession.
Right.
Because of what that implies. With secession, they're going to lose everything that benefits them by being a state. If they were to divorce, I think she's thinking divorce settlement type things where all the things that they like the money coming into them from the blue states, disaster.
They can choose. They can sue for support for the equivalent of child support.
Yeah, basically, I'm just thinking that she may be in her mind thinking that this word is going to work better for her, and she can propose this and get some more traction with the whole idea and the anger. Yeah. Because down here in Arizona, we had Carrie Lake before the last election just really coming out hard about seceding from the union. And it was gaining huge traction until there were papers started writing up, what you're going to lose and how it was going to pertain to people's.
You're going to lose your water
lives.
To begin with.
Yeah,
it's like
you're gonna. You can just go through this list that's endless of the things that they'll lose. But anyways, it's just food for thought, and I was wondering, is there any danger to what she's doing?
Well, I think she's not using the words. I think she's not using the word secession because most people associate that word with the Civil War and 600,000 dead Americans. And that's not real appealing. Divorce is something that has become common. I mean, it happens to about half of marriages. Mm-hmm. So, not a big deal. And I think you're probably right that she's got some kind of a child support plan.
I think so, because down here, like I said, Carrie Lake was using the dirtiest word. Yeah. And all of a sudden, like I said, there was a huge gain. It was really shocking me. It was gaining real momentum here, along with our people that were carrying firearms to guard the voting boxes. And all of a sudden, once the newspapers started putting out lists of what people would lose, it lost. I mean, nobody was saying that word anymore.
Yeah, you no longer want Social Security. You no longer want Medicare. You no longer want, water from the Interstate Water Compact. Right. There you go. Lydia, thank you. Thanks for the information. That was fascinating. 21 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. 21 minutes past the hour. No, that reminds me of when I was a country western DJ back when I was 16 years old. You were too. That's right, Sean. You started out as a country DJ. I like that music. Welcome back. Sorry, there's a lot going on. Donald Trump is returning to the scene of the crime. Will Bunch is writing. This is from the Philadelphia Inquirer, reprinted over at Common Dreams.
He said that when he was elected, he promised that he would, quote, deliver a better life for all the people across this nation that have been ignored, neglected, and abandoned. Right. But as Pete Buttigieg is pointing out, Donald Trump was, quote, among those who have sided with the rail industry again and again and again as they have fought safety regulations on railroads and hazardous materials tooth and nail. The mayor of East Palestine, Trent Conaway, had come out a couple of days ago, I think it was yesterday or the day before, and basically trash-talked Joe Biden for going to Ukraine. Must have been yesterday, for going to Ukraine rather than coming to East Palestine or Palestine. Pete Buttigieg is going to be there tomorrow, by the way, and congratulating Donald Trump for coming. Now he's backing away from that. He's a registered Republican, and now he's saying, we just want to go back to living our lives the way they were. I don't want to be a soundbite or a news bite. Yeah, right. A little late for that. But I think it's going to be really interesting. I mean, here you're going to have Donald Trump, and as far as I can tell, the visit has not yet happened. At least I'm not seeing it on, I think we're monitoring MSNBC on our studio monitor here today. Haven't seen any reference to it. But if the people, Will Bunch says this so well, he says, in fact, if the residents of East Palestine, a modern news desert of downsized or disappeared news sources, which allows misinformation to fester. If those residents really knew the reality, a delegation of townsfolk would likely greet Trump with tiki torches and pitchforks. He said maybe it was the more than $6 million that the railroad industry, including Norfolk Southern, donated to GOP candidates in 2016, plus millions more in spending. Trump had been in office for less than a year when he moved to kill the 2015 rule change initiated by the Obama administration that would have required freight trains to upgrade the current braking technology that was developed back in the 1800s in exchange for state-of-the-art electronic systems. The modern brakes were supposed to be in place by 2021, 2 years ago, under this new rule that Obama had put into place. But Trump said, nah. After the GOP took $6 million from the industry, Trump said, nah, it's okay. You don't need those kind of brakes. Right. And you don't even need to notify people of dangerous cargo. That was Trump's thing, too. So how's this going to play out? I don't know. I'm looking for the video when it happens. I suspect it's going to be real interesting. The other story I wanted to share with you real quickly here today, and then we will be hitting a break at the bottom of the hour, and I'll pick up your phone calls for the rest of the hour, is Oksana Markarova is an official with the Ukrainian government and has a Twitter account. The Twitter account, if you want to follow it. Well, actually, I retweeted her tweet. The easiest way would, if you're following my Twitter feed, just look at my Twitter feed from today, because I retweeted this morning. She tweets, thank you to these 5 Republicans. And I'm echoing her sentiment. These 5 Republicans, the day after Joe Biden was there, maybe 2 days after Joe Biden was there, I don't do time very well. Has it been 2 days since he was there? Yeah. In any case, these 5 Republicans followed his footsteps. They flew to Poland. They took the 10-hour train to Kyiv. They met with Zelensky. They walked around Kyiv. They saw what was going on, and they called for F-16s, American F-16s, to be given. These are Republicans, F-16s to be given to Ukraine. And she's thanking them. She says, thank you, Chairman Representative McCall, Congressman Darrell Issa, Representative Keith Self, Representative Max Miller, Representative Jake Elzy, and for your visit to Kyiv, for meeting with President Zelensky, and for important signals of support to Ukraine and our fight for freedom. Together we win. And, I have been one of the most outspoken critics of Darrell Issa, particularly back in the day, 10 years ago, when he was a real I felt a real threat to American democracy. He was just doing some wacky stuff. But he did the right thing here. And I think he needs to be, and Representative McCall, Representative Self, Representative Miller, Representative Elzy, I think they need to be recognized for this. Good on you guys. Good on you. It's 27 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with your calls in just a moment.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Exposing the con and conservative. I'll be right back with your calls on the other side of this break.
Book today is Midnight in Chernobyl, the untold story of the world's greatest nuclear disaster by Adam Higginbotham. This is from the prologue. Saturday, April 26, 1986, 4:16 p.m., Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station, Ukraine. Senior Lieutenant Alexander Logachev loved radiation the way other men love their wives. Tall and good-looking, 26 years old, with close-cropped dark hair and ice blue eyes, Logachev had joined the Soviet Army when he was still a boy. They had trained him well. The instructors from the military academy outside Moscow taught him with lethal poisons and unshielded radiation. He traveled to the testing grounds of Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan and to the desolate East Urals Trace, where the fallout from a clandestine radioactive accident still poisoned the landscape. Eventually, Logachev's training took him even to the remote and forbidden islands of Novaya Zemlya, high in the Arctic Circle, and ground zero for the detonation of the terrible Tsar Bomba, the largest thermonuclear device in history. Now, as the lead radiation reconnaissance officer of the 427th Red Banner Mechanized Regiment of the Kiev District Civil Defense Force, Logachev knew how to protect himself and his three-man crew from nerve agents, biological weapons, gamma rays, and hot particles, by doing their work just as the textbooks dictated, by trusting his dosimetry equipment, and, when necessary, reaching for the nuclear, bacterial, and chemical warfare medical kits stored in the cockpit of their armored car. But he also believed that the best protection was psychological. These men who allowed themselves to fear radiation were most at risk. But those who came to love and appreciate its spectral presence, to understand its caprices, could endure even the most intense gamma bombardment and emerge as healthy as before. As he sped through the suburbs of Kiev that morning at the head of a column of more than 30 vehicles summoned to an emergency at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Logachev had every reason to feel confident. The spring air blowing through the hatches of his armored scout car carried the smell of the trees and the freshly cut grass. His men, gathered on the parade ground just the night before for their monthly inspection, were drilled and ready. At his feet, a battery of radiological detection instruments, including a newly installed electronic device twice as sensitive as the old model, murmured softly, revealing nothing unusual in the atmosphere around them. But as they finally approached the plant later that morning, it became clear that something extraordinary had happened. The alarm on the radiation dosimeter first sounded as they passed the concrete signpost marking the perimeter of the power station grounds, and the lieutenant gave orders to stop the vehicle and log their findings. 51 roentgens per hour. If they waited here just 60 minutes, they would all absorb the maximum dose of radiation permitted Soviet troops during wartime. They drove on, following the line of high-voltage transmission towers that marched toward the horizon in the direction of the power plant. Their readings climbed still further before falling again. Then, as the armored car rumbled along the concrete bank of the station's cooling canal, the outline of the fourth unit of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant finally became visible, and Logachev and his crew gazed at it in silence. The roof of the 20-story building had been torn open, its other upper levels blackened and collapsed into heaps of rubble. They could see shattered panels of ferroconcrete, tumbled blocks of graphite, and here and there the glittering metal casings of fuel assemblies from the core of a nuclear reactor. A cloud of steam drifted from the wreckage into the sunlit sky. Yet they had orders to conduct a full reconnaissance of the plant. Their armored car crawled counterclockwise around the complex at 10 kilometers an hour. Sergeant Vlaskin called out the radiation readings from the new instruments, and Logachev scribbled them down on a map, hand-drawn on a sheet of parchment paper in ballpoint pen and colored marker. 1 roentgen per hour, then 2, then 3. They turned left and the figures began to rise quickly. 10, 30, 50, 100. 250 roentgens an hour, the sergeant shouted, his eyes widening. Comrade Lieutenant, he began, and pointed at the radiometer. Logachev looked down at the digital readout and felt his scalp prickle with terror. 2,080 roentgens an hour.
an impossible number. Logashov struggled to remain calm and remember the textbook, to conquer his fear. But his training failed him, and the lieutenant heard himself screaming in panic at the driver, petrified that the vehicle would stall. "Why are you going this way, you son of a bee? Are you out of your effing mind? If this thing dies, we'll all be corpses in 15 minutes. Part 1, Chapter 1, The Soviet Prometheus. At the slow beat of approaching rotor blades, black birds rose into the sky, scattering over the frozen meadows and the pearly knots of creeks and ponds lacing the Pripyat River basin. Far below, standing knee-deep in snow, his breath lingering in heavy clouds, Viktor Brukhanov awaited the arrival of the nomenklatura from Moscow. When the helicopter touched down, the delegation of ministers and Communist Party officials trudged together over the icy field. The savage cold gnawed at their heavy woolen coats and nipped beneath their tall fur hats. The head of the Ministry of Energy and Electrification of the USSR and senior party bosses from the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine joined Brukhanov at the spot where their audacious new project was to begin. Just 34 years old, clever and ambitious, a dedicated party man, Brukhanov had come to Western Ukraine with orders to begin building what would become the greatest nuclear power station on Earth. Midnight at Chernobyl. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. So everybody knows that George Santos is from a district that Joe Biden won by 16 points, New York's 3rd district, although there was a kind of a gerrymandering, or excuse me, a reapportionment thing that happened there. But it's generally a Democratic district, and if Santos falls, there's probably going to be a Democratic replacement. But that's just the beginning of the story. David Vallejo in California's 22nd district, for example, represents a district that Biden carried by 16 points. Young's 40th, Biden carried by 15 points. Mike Garcia in California's 27th, Biden carried by 18 points. Biden carried by 11 points, Oregon's 5th, Lori Chavez Duremer. Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania's 1st, Biden carried it by 14 points. I've got a whole video that lists all of these. There's 18 of them that should be easy pickups for the Democrats in 2024. It's over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. 35 minutes past the hour, and picking up your calls, Bob in Longview, Washington. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind today?
How you doing, Tom?
Good, good. How's Longview?
Yeah, it's snowing over here.
Yeah, it is here too in Portland. I get just wild weather all across the country today, apparently.
I know. What I was calling about was Marjorie Taylor Greene's brilliant idea of a divorce for America. Last year, I wrote a fairly in-depth analysis of what it would take to break up the United States. Mm-hmm. And it's virtually impossible. There's several problems that I noted in the analysis, but the biggest one was like, what do you do with the military and nuclear weapons?
Yeah, it's not a serious proposal. I mean, what these people are actually wishing out loud for is a white nationalist homeland. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are white nationalist Christian supremacists or white supremacists, and Christian nationalists. And L.A. My Style called that out. And there's a good piece from his piece over at Democratic Underground about that, just saying that this is really what they're talking about. And they're talking in the faintest of codes. But I think you're absolutely right. What do you do? And a lot of the nukes actually are in red states right now across the Midwest.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a map in the analysis that it really shows the depth of the problem. But, I think also there are some lefties, too, that, are not happy about, living with these nut jobs on the right. I hear it a lot. And so that's the reason why I did the analysis. It was just to see what it would take to do it. And it's impossible. I mean, you've got corporate infrastructure, interstate commerce, the grid, the electrical grid, which we share with Canada. There's just a whole bunch of issues.
Right. Not to mention Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, our tax system, our public education systems, our colleges. It goes on and on and on. It's not at all practical, but it is a great distraction from Republican efforts to privatize Social Security and Medicare. Mike Pence last night went on one of the business television networks and came right out and said it. Cuts to Social Security and Medicare need to put on the table. Did you hear it?
Yep, I heard him.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. Just breathtaking stuff. I mean, how these guys think they can get elected by this is just it baffles me.
Well, I think, Tom, it's just their ideology. They are. I mean, that is what they believe, and it's part of that. I hate to say this, but it's part of their Christian theology, or how they perceive the Bible. And they incorporate that into their politics. And I think this started back, in the 70s when Reagan was rising to power. And, remember the old moral majority and
the Jerry Falwell and company, along with the movement that Hal Lindsey was really promoting with this, the late great Planet Earth books, and then the Left Behind series that followed those. There was this shift in how Christianity, or at least how white Christians identified themselves and what their theology was. I mean, they basically abandoned Jesus and went with Paul and if John actually wrote Revelation, John. I'm skeptical of that, but nonetheless, it's not been a good thing. I don't think for them or for this nation or for any of us. Bob, I need to move along, but thank you for the call. It's great stuff. John in Seattle. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi, Tom. I wanted to. The president of Turkey is
Erdogan is how it's pronounced.
Erdogan, yeah.
The G is like a W.
Isn't he holding us up for Finland and Sweden to be able to join NATO?
Just Sweden. What happened was is your question why is he doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's what happened. Sweden has laws that protect free expression, the expression of free speech, and they're equivalent of our First Amendment. And there was an anti-immigrant group in Sweden, which is the principal thing that animates the hard right in Sweden and all across Europe. And this dates back to when Russia was bombing the crap out of Syria back more than about a decade ago, and destroyed Aleppo and large parts of Damascus and the regions around there. In order to defend their naval bases in Syria and defend the Assad regime that was killing its people. And Assad was killing its people. This was the Arab Spring thing because the desert had come south. The farmers got wiped out. They ended up in the big cities in Aleppo and Damascus demanding food. And so Assad came out and just started shooting people. So the Russians came in to help out Assad. And in the process, they killed tens of thousands of people and rendered millions homeless. And so out of those millions of Syrians who were homeless, and hundreds of thousands, well, millions of them actually, fled across the Mediterranean into southern Italy, into Greece, and made their way up into Central and Northern Europe. Germany took in 1 million of them, which was a big deal. I mean, Angela Merkel they took in the majority of them. Sweden took in a whole bunch of them. Italy took in a whole bunch of them. Now you've got a right-wing government in Italy that is run by a woman who was literally a fascist. I mean, a Mussolini fascist. And her whole issue was there's too many brown people now in this country. We need to stop, any more of these Syrians or any of these people from Northern Africa from coming into Italy. Same thing in Sweden. You've got a right-wing government now in Sweden, and it's entirely anti-immigrant. You got the same thing happening in France. You got the same thing happening in Germany. I mean, right across Europe now, this is happening. So in Sweden, this right-wing group was going to hold a demonstration against more immigrants and wanting to expel some of the immigrants who were there. And in the process, what they did was they burned a Koran. So once they burned the Koran, which Sweden defended, saying free speech,
Erdogan saw that he's a dictator and he's in big trouble down in Turkey. He's destroyed democracy in a NATO country, and declared himself basically dictator for life. But he's having real crises, and this was before the earthquakes. Because he's not popular. More than half of the country wants to get rid of him. They want a democracy back. And so Erdogan saw this as something that he could demagogue. He could turn it into a big deal. And so he started talking about how, Sweden is disrespecting Islam and they're disrespecting quack, quack, quack. And therefore, he was going to block the entrance of Sweden into NATO. Well, Sweden then came out and said, Finland came out and said, we want to join NATO at the same time as Sweden does. So it's not seen as a unilateral slap in the face to Russia. It's seen as a regional action because Finland has an 800-mile-long border with Russia, where they have fought 2 wars with Russia in just in the last 200 years on that border. And so they want, Finland doesn't want to join NATO if Sweden doesn't go with them. Both of these countries have been neutral since World War II, or since after World War II. And so Sweden is, saying, well, we want to get in, and Erdogan is blocking it, and the rules of NATO are that it has to be unanimous. It's a consensus, just like the UN. It's consensus driven. And so right now Erdogan is holding it up, and he's holding it up basically as a political play for his own popularity, because they still have elections in Turkey. They're just not, it's like in Hungary, where the opposition parties are marginalized and the media is owned by friends of Erdogan and all that sort of stuff. So you can't really call it a democracy any longer. It's really an autocracy. But that's the whole story, John. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, the other one is that Turkey, when I see on the news Turkey, it looks like the Ukraine. And if he doesn't get it, that's what will happen to Turkey if he wants Turkey to,
Well, now they're dealing with this horrible earthquake, and that's a real crisis. John, I got to run, but thank you for the call.
Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It will shortly be 45 minutes past the hour, and I will continue picking up your phone calls on the other side of this break. Stay with us. And welcome back. Bill in Richmond, Virginia. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, Tom. Hi, thanks for taking my call. I was listening to the lady with Common Cause, and I've got some problems with this in general. I'm 76 years old, and I grew up in Memphis. I know every voting right prohibition that was put in, poll tax, you name it. So you take the progression of time, the 2022 election in Georgia, where everybody was suing them about their voting changes and whatnot. They had a record turnout. They surveyed the African-American voters. They said they were pleased. There were no major problems, glitches. So right now, I can go to any southern state, and it is a heck of a lot easier to vote.
Well, the exceptions actually to that are Texas and Florida, where you've got governors that have actively been arresting black felons and parading them for TV cameras. And that produced a measurable decrease in the black vote in the 2022 election in Florida when Ron DeSantis did that. But you're right. People, they put up barriers and people get around those barriers. But that's only one small piece of it, Bill. The bigger pieces of it have to do with reapportionment, having to do with gerrymandering. I mean, you've got states where the vote is roughly 50-50, but the congressional delegation is like 70-30 in favor of Republicans, simply because of gerrymandering.
Can I cite Maryland if you want to?
Well, yeah, you've got Democratic gerrymanders too. Let's do away with all of them, Bill.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I agree with that. I also agree. I also dislike corporate money. I really do, because I know. I was listening to what you were talking about the railroad. That wasn't all a Trump deal. If you look at the figures, the railroad industry gave Democrats just about the same amount of money, and it's gone on for years.
But Democrats were not deregulating the railroads. That was Donald Trump. The Democrats actually put into place the regulation on the railroads, whether they were taking the money or not.
But I did want to ask you one other question real quick on this. And I remember in the last, the polling that came out before the State of the Union about with only 30-some-odd% of the people were happy with what's happened in the last 2 years. Well, I saw something today on C-SPAN that made me understand why. I am middle class. I've got a pretty decent retirement that I saved my own, don't have a pension. And most of my friends fall in that category. And I'll tell you how the feeling is. And this isn't just white Southerners. And I lived in Ohio, too. Basically, the middle class does not get any real benefits from any of these programs that are coming down the road.
You don't get a mortgage deduction?
I'm not going to pardon me?
You don't get a mortgage deduction? You don't get safe roads and streets? You don't get good police and fire? Actually, a lot of those things are not even available to people in many poor communities, you know?
Okay, but then this brings up the point of what the fellow said the other day on C-SPAN. All this thing about cutting the military, Medicaid, Social Security. He said, if the concern is the debt, and it's not just a Republican thing, you know the only way he says it can be done?
I'm
the
listening.
way it normally happens. There would be a tax increase on the middle class.
No, well, if we just roll
the money.
It doesn't need to be a tax increase on the middle class, Bill. The middle class is adequately taxed. In fact, people making between $100,000 and $500,000 a year, or maybe $1 million, something like that, I think are wildly overtaxed. We need to raise taxes on the very, very rich. Bill, I got to run. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio and tag you're it. Gene in Jackson, Missouri. Hey, Gene, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I appreciate you taking my call. Let me preface this by saying I'm very conservative. And I'm former Blue Cross vice president for 27 years. But I listened to your show for years. I do enjoy it. I do like to listen to the things that you talk about. I'm impressed with your intelligence. You've written 10 or 12 books. I do not know how you've done that. It took me 6 years to write one. And But there are some things I'd like to converse with you about.
Okay, I knew there was a but coming, Gene, after all that buttering up. What is it?
I'm still going to listen to you. Number one, your standing bet. I want to win one of your books.
Okay.
About good service last 40 years.
Yeah.
Okay. The Democrats had total control of Congress for 42 years and never passed $1 being covered on Medicare on prescription drugs. When George H. Bush got elected, he passed, first time ever, covering up to $2,500 per year on prescription drugs.
You mean George W. Bush, right?
Democrats, yeah, that's right. And I'm sorry, yeah. And the Democrats, their comeback was, well, $2,500, that's nothing. And the stupid Republicans said, well, yeah, but it's a start. Instead of saying 2,500 is better than nothing. The others, would you agree on that they passed that?
I agree that they passed that, but they passed it as part of a program to privatize Medicare. And that was the Medicare Reform Act of 2003. And that...
No.
No? Okay.
No.
Educate me.
No. They... you're always talking about Medicare Advantage.
Right.
Do you know a lot about Medicare Advantage, Tom?
I do.
Okay, let's see. You claim it's a sham and some other things. I've heard the congressman on there with you. Do you know why they had to do the Medicare Advantage? Because when Clinton was president, Medicare was way in the hole. And they had a meeting of the insurance companies to see if they could transfer some of that, those claims, and so they got together, and they couldn't call it Medicare, so they called it Medicare Advantage.
Right.
I've been on it 7 years, have not paid a premium. I had $1,800,000 heart attack claim, 2 new knees, and it cost me $1,800.
Well, you got a good plan, Gene. You got a good plan. I'm not denying that there are some Medicare Advantage programs out there, particularly if you don't travel, like, the Kaiser programs. But even Kaiser, I mean, they were the number, when the New York Times did their investigation, about 3 months ago, Kaiser was one of the top 3 companies that was, ripping off the government, that was ripping off you and me.
Yeah, well, Kaiser...
And the whole...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Gene.
Kaiser's plan is an HMO. In other words, you're very limited. I would never buy or sell an HMO.
Right.
A PPO, I mean, it's open pretty good. And if I'm out of network in emergency, it's covered.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so let's
and here's the other thing.
All right, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm trying to get back to your original call here, rather than turning this into a debate about Medicare Advantage. Because I would love to send you an autographed book if you're right, and maybe I'm misinformed about this, or I just didn't know. I thought that the Medicare Part D plan, which does prescription drugs, was tied into. It was tied into something really toxic, and I thought in my head I was recalling that it was tied into Medicare Advantage. Was it tied into prohibiting the government from negotiating prices on drugs? I mean, what was the upside for the pharmaceutical industry?
No, I'm sorry, it really wasn't tied to anything, because this came out, had nothing to do with Medicare Advantage. Do you remember when George Bush got reelected and he said he had some, what was the term he used?
Political capital.
Because, and he was going to use it. That's one of the things he used it on.
Right. Well, he said he was going to use it to privatize Social Security, specifically.
Right.
He went on a 20-city tour to do that.
Well, let me ask you another question, and I don't want to take that, but I enjoy the conversation. Let me ask you another question. There are 65 million people drawing Social Security. Now, do you think the Republicans are stupid enough that they don't know that 25 or 30 million of those people are Republicans?
It appears to be that's the case. I mean, Mike Pence went on national television last night and said we need to put Medicare and Social Security cuts on the table.
Well, okay. Now let me back up.
How bright is that?
Let me back up. Okay, let me back up. Because a few say it, and that's an idea of keeping Medicare and
Gene,
Social Security.
Republicans have opposed Medicare since 1965 when it was put into law. They've opposed Social Security since 1935 when that was put into law. And to get back to your earlier point, Medicare Advantage was not put into place because Medicare was failing. Medicare Advantage is costing America more than Medicare. It costs every single person who's on Medicare Advantage is costing our government more money than every single person who's on regular Medicare. And it's not working to the advantage of the country. It's working to the advantage of the insurance companies that were spiffing Bush and the Republicans who put it into law.
No. Do you know what Obama did when he got elected? He took $500 million out of Medicare Advantage because it was working so good, and put it in his Obamacare plan and did away with Medicare Advantage. Except he let Governor Nelson in Florida, to get his vote on Obamacare, keep his $7 million on a Medicare Advantage that he had in the state there. And the only thing that the government
there was all kinds of dancing around the money there, Gene. But that that doesn't mean that Medicare Advantage is any kind of a bargain for Americans at all. And yes, there are some people who've had good experiences with it. You apparently are one of them. I'll take you at your word. But it is a.
Are there seniors out there? Are there seniors out there that can't afford a supplement plan?
Well, that's the problem, and that's where there are some people who just literally can't afford to even pay for the Medicare, and much less a supplement, and Medicare Advantage fills that hole. Tragically, this needs to be fixed. Privatizing it through Medicare Advantage is not the way to fix it. Gene, I wanted to talk to you about the free book or the contest, but give us a call tomorrow and talk to Joyce about it. I'll fill her in. We'll be right back. We're not back. It's the end of the show. Gene, I got to run. I'm sorry. Thank you for the call. Wow. Okay. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same bat channel. In the meantime, Don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us. That includes you. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon. And be careful of the weather, huh?
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.